Chapter 1. Master Sulen, are you saying that you stole someone else's wife and ran away because you were afraid of being hunted down? How can you accuse me of something I didn't do? What do you mean by running away? This is a strategic shift. Madam Elizabeth Jia and I are truly in love. How can you bumpkins know the greatness of true love? Su Luan said loudly and righteously. How can you call it stealing when it's a noble's business? We're in love. Do you understand? What followed was a series of words that were difficult to understand, such as guardian knights, masquerade ball, and a bunch of other terms that no one could understand. The caravan was filled with a joyous atmosphere. In the open wilderness, a caravan was slowly moving forward. Su Len sat in a carriage piled with goods, holding a straw in his mouth as he argued loudly with the mercenaries around him. Next to him was a half-empty bottle of rum. The autumn sun was still a little harsh. An old cloak hung from a sword on the guardrail of the carriage, blocking most of the noon sun. Traveling in the wilderness was a very boring thing. In order to pass the time, the caravan would also talk about some interesting things. The road in the wilderness was rugged and uneven. Even if the carriage was stacked with thick straw to reduce the shock, it was not very comfortable. However, compared to those who traveled on foot or on horseback, it was much more comfortable. Enemy attack! Enemy attack! Defend! Just when Su Len was bored, a loud shout suddenly came from the front. The caravan immediately stopped moving forward. All the carriages began to form a defensive circle with the front of the carriage facing inwards. Looking at these people's busy but orderly movements, it was obvious that this was not the first time. Su Len had already picked up his sword and stood on the carriage looking into the distance. In the wilderness in the distance, a scout was riding a horse and galloping toward them. Behind him, hundreds of black shadows were quickly approaching. When they got closer, they could see clearly that they were gnolls. Gnolls were very dangerous creatures in the wilderness. Adult gnolls were more than 2 meters tall, and the male gnolls were about 2 meters tall. They had sharp claws and teeth, and their strength and speed were superior to that of ordinary humans. They were also bloodthirsty and cruel. More importantly, gnolls were tribal creatures. A small tribe had at least a few dozen warriors, a medium-sized tribe had at least a few hundred, and a large tribe had even more. Gnolls were not the most numerous species in the wilderness. The most numerous species were goblins and kobolds. Compared to gnolls, goblins and kobolds were much weaker. Even a farmer could easily deal with 3 goblins if he was careful. These monsters were useless except for their numbers. Gnolls were not wild beasts. On the contrary, they were highly intelligent and could make weapons and armor. Although their equipment was very crude compared to humans, it was enough to survive in the wilderness. The gnolls in the distance quickly approached. Su Len could clearly see their dark green skin, dirty dark yellow manes, and coyote-like heads. In addition to these gnolls, there were even more kobolds and gnomes. They were probably the gnolls' enslaved cannon fodder. The gnolls had poor discipline, and the goblins and kobolds were even worse. A group of monsters rushed over in a disorderly manner, but when they saw the chariot formation, they could not help but stop 150 meters away from the chariot formation. Whether it was gnolls, kobolds, or gnomes, they mostly relied on human wave tactics. It was because of the hundreds of monsters that they had the courage to directly attack a caravan of more than 20 carriages. Yigas was a gnoll leader. He led a small gnoll tribe. He had personally bitten off his father's throat and inherited it. Under his leadership, the small tribe continued to grow in strength and was developing into a medium-sized tribe. Hundreds of gnoll warriors, along with hundreds of gnomes and kobolds, were a force to be reckoned with in the entire wilderness. He had a total of 30 gnoll barbarians. As an advanced type of gnoll, these gnoll barbarians were taller and stronger than ordinary gnolls. It could be said that he could rely on these 30 gnoll barbarians to wipe out a small tribe. It was also because of these 30 gnoll barbarians that he had enough confidence to besiege a caravan of more than 20 carriages. When they got closer, the two sides began to confront each other. Yiga's cold eyes revealed a hint of mockery. He already felt that victory was in his hands. After the previous long-distance attack, the gnolls were fine, but the kobolds and gnomes were already panting. If the humans dared to directly attack at this time, these kobolds and gnomes would not be able to stop them. However, if the humans really did so, the result would be very tragic. The humans could still resist by relying on the defensive circle formed by the carriages. If they attacked, he was confident that he could directly crush them with the 30 gnoll barbarians. In fact, he originally planned to do so, but the humans were too cowardly and did not dare to attack. So now he could only command the kobolds and gnomes to attack. The two sides confronted each other for a while. After seeing that the humans did not show any flaws, Yeagus directly commanded the gnolls to drive the gnomes and kobolds to attack. Sulen looked at the group of bandits not far away and was filled with excitement. In his eyes, these bandits were all experience bags. He had been in this fantasy world for more than 10 years. Until now, he still remembered that he was hiding in his dormitory on a dark and windy night playing Rise of Empires 8. He was controlling Brother Yun to carry the Tsong Emperor sword all over the map to find immortals to increase his attributes. In the end, he was too tired from staying up all night and fell asleep. When he woke up again, he was in this world. He had become the owner of Sulen's body. As for the original owner, Sulen, he was the son of a noble. Originally, he still yearned for the corrupt life of a feudal and medieval noble. However, although Sulen was not an illegitimate child, his mother was a maid who passed away when he was 8 years old. Sulen was so sad because of his mother's death that he could not breathe and died. Then, a soul from another world took over the body with the Rise of Empire system. Although his father was a count, his situation was far from that of his cheap brothers. Compared to those servants, he didn't have to work at all. After recovering, Sulen wanted to change this situation. Then, he began to learn martial arts and knowledge. With the help of the system, his martial arts improved rapidly. Whether it was practicing or sparring, he would gain experience. Just by accumulating experience through years of training, Sulen's martial arts and body became stronger at an unimaginable speed. Moreover, after transmigrating, he obtained 3 initial characteristics. Valiant. Greatly increases the chance of activating a sure kill skill. Swift Thunder. Greatly increases the speed of attack. Pegasus. Greatly increases the speed of movement. With these 3 characteristics in hand, Su Luan's reputation in Kalen City rose in the next few years. In addition, he was a noble himself. If this continued, it would be easy for Su Luan to gather a group of followers and fight for a noble title. However, on a hot summer day this year, the blood father of this body, Count Vonner Cullen, decided to grant Surin a baronetcy for some unknown reason when the fire of his life was about to be extinguished. He made Surin a noble with real power. Chapter 2. Even though Vonner had 1 foot in the grave, his decision was still unquestionable. Even though his wife and son were against the order, Vonner still wanted to carry it out. However, fate played a joke on Sulen. Before the order was officially issued, Vonner Cullen had already returned to heaven. In fact, Sulen seriously suspected that Vonner was killed by his wife and son. The new Earl Callan did not recognize the previous order at all, so Surin became a thorn in the side of his nominal elder brother, Earl Callan. What could Sulen do? All he could do was reason with him. Sulen, use reason to convince people. On a dark and windy night, Sulen entered the heavily guarded Thorn Castle alone and found his beloved brother. First, Sulen had a reason, with more than 30 knights in the castle, and broke them. Count Cullen finally forgave Sulen. After a friendly exchange, Sulen agreed to give up his barony and keep his noble status, while Count Cullen gave up 5,000 kinner as compensation to Sulen. After receiving the compensation, Sulen didn't stay in Cullen City any longer. He immediately brought Kinnar to the northern province and encountered this scene. Roar! Charge! Tear them apart! Roars could be heard, followed by a group of gnomes and kobolds charging over while shouting some unknown slogan. Archers! Get ready! Fire! More than 20 arrows were shot out from the carriages. There were only 60 to 70 people in the caravan, and only half of the guards. Although there weren't many human guards, they worked well together. They used the defenses of the carriages to keep the kobolds outside, and a group of spearmen stabbed the goblins and kobolds to death between the gaps of the carriages. Sulen found a spear in the carriage and waved it around. The spear created a series of afterimages as it slashed across the throats of the goblins and kobolds, causing blood to splatter everywhere. The jackalans, who were supervising the battle, did not step forward. They intended to let these cannon fodder consume the strength of the humans. When the humans were exhausted, the jackalans would attack and tear the chariot formation apart in one fell swoop. A large number of kobolds and goblins charged forward, and corpses soon piled up in front of the carts. Under normal circumstances, the kobolds and gnomes would have fled for their lives after suffering such great losses. However, because of the gnolls behind them, these kobolds and gnomes had no choice but to continue attacking. Soon, the battle became more and more intense. Large numbers of gnomes and kobolds died, and corpses piled up in front of the carts to form a slope. In a short 15 minutes, the kobolds and goblins had suffered at least 100 casualties. On the human side, only 2 unlucky fellows were dragged off the carriage and dismembered. At this point, the kobolds and goblins were on the verge of collapse. Even with the gnolls supervising the battle, it was useless. Of course they did contribute. At least the humans had exhausted a lot of their strength. Yiga slowly stepped forward and roared at the human carts. More than 100 gnolls behind him roared as well. In the next second, these bloodthirsty and cruel gnolls charged forward. It's over. Damn it! Raise your weapons if you don't want to die. Seeing the gnolls charging, many people were so scared that their faces turned pale. They could not even hold their weapons properly. The leader of the guards saw this and hurriedly shouted, trying to calm the soldiers down. However, the effect was limited. In Sullen's system, the morale of the humans dropped from 80 to 60. If it dropped any lower, there would be deserters. The kobolds and goblins' morale, which was originally 40, instantly rose to 70. The gnolls' morale even reached 90. Seeing the gnolls charging at him, Sulen jumped off the carriage with his spear. With the buff of the Pegasus, Sullen's speed was amazing. The sharp blade of the spear slashed through the bodies of the kobolds and goblins who had just recovered their morale. Without the goblins and kobolds blocking, Sulen quickly confronted the gnolls. Seeing a human charging at it, the gnolls revealed a ferocious smile. They were already about to bite off the human's neck. Rip! The sound of metal tearing flesh and bones could be heard. The 2-meter-tall gnolls were directly lifted up by the spear and then sent flying. Sullen's attack did not scare the gnolls at all. Instead, it made them even crazier. Many gnolls gave up on attacking and directly waved their spiked clubs to attack Sulen. In the end, they were easily sent flying by his spear. The gnolls, whose morale was high, became even crazier. They did not even look at their dead comrades. More gnolls rushed forward again. Whirling cherry. 4 streams of aura chi appeared as the spear spun. Then, the gnolls that rushed up were enveloped by the spinning aura chi. The aura chi was like countless sharp knives. Countless wounds appeared on the gnolls' bodies in an instant. Then, the gnolls were sent flying back at a speed faster than when they rushed up. Oh my god! Is this real? Sun god above. Is a knight this strong? The guards standing on the defensive carriage formation saw Sullen's performance and all of them opened their mouths wide. In just a few short breaths, the number of gnolls who died at Sullen's hands had exceeded 2 digits. After that, Sulen did not have any intention of stopping. He moved quickly on the battlefield, cutting down everything he passed as if he was cutting grass. The morale of the humans, who were on the verge of collapse, suddenly soared. In contrast, the morale of the gnolls fell to 70. More importantly, the gnolls lost more than 30 in such a short time. Seeing the heavy losses of the gnolls, Yigas let out an angry howl and rushed toward Sulen with 30 gnoll barbarian soldiers. It looked like it wanted to surround and kill Sulen. Seeing the gnoll barbarian soldiers surrounding him, Sulen did not have any intention of retreating. Instead, he sped up and rushed forward. When he was 3 or 4 meters away from the gnoll barbarian soldiers, Sulen suddenly let out a roar. Thunder spear! Then, Sullen's originally strong body swelled as if it was filled with air. With the crackling of bones, Sullen's body grew from 1.9 meters to about 2 meters. The contours of his muscles gave off an amazing feeling of strength. Bolts of lightning appeared around his body, jumping on his weapons and body. The gnoll barbarian soldiers who were close to him suddenly stiffened. Thunderstorm! The nearly 3-meter-long spear was wrapped in a layer of blue lightning. Countless lightning bolts flew out from the rotating spear like a thunderstorm. The lightning balls were like a storm, sweeping across a 10-meter radius with Sulen as the center. All the gnolls in this area were electrocuted into charcoal. Even the gnoll leader was seriously injured. Then the spear pierced through his throat. Chapter 3. Following the death of the gnoll leader Yigas, there were no more ripples in the battle. The gnolls and kobolds had long since lost their morale and fled in all directions. The gnolls had also lost their morale after Yigas' death. Sulen did not let these gnolls go. In his eyes they were all EXP. Every time he killed a gnoll, a line of green text would appear in the lower right corner of his vision. EXP plus 10. Compared to the plus 1 EXP given by the kobolds and gnolls, the plus 30 EXP given by the gnoll barbarian soldiers, and the gnoll leader gave the most EXP, which was a full 100 EXP. Although Su Len had the Pegasus characteristic and moved very quickly, he could not kill all the remaining gnolls by himself. After all, these gnolls were not slow either. After killing the last gnoll in sight, Su Len looked at the battlefield. At this time, there was not a single living monster left on the battlefield. There were more than 70 gnoll corpses on the battlefield, and even more corpses of kobolds and gnolls. At this time, Sullen's ears rang with a system notification. The battle is over. You have obtained a glorious victory. In this battle, you have obtained an item. Fine Steel X2. Losses: 2, enemies killed, 258 EXP gained. 1457, EXP gained, 300. Congratulations on leveling up. You have received 2 attribute points, 2 skill points, and a silver treasure chest. Name: Sullen Race, Human Level, 12, 136120000, Strength, 26 Agility, 28 Spirit, 19 Vitality, 25 Charm, 18, your handsome appearance makes it easy for you to gain the favor of others. High enough charm tells you that you can really rely on your face to make a living. Your attractiveness to the opposite sex has increased. You have a chance to get a better price when doing business. Command: 60. When you lead an army, you can increase the combat power of the army. Characteristics: Valiant, Thunderbolt, Pegasus skills, Dark Ice Slash, Lightning Spear Military Advisor skill. Elementary boost morale, bluffing effect is limited, morale plus 5, ultimate skill. Whirling Cherry, proficient, heroic, advanced, torrential storm, beginner, weapon proficiency. Sword 156, gun 160, bow 88, throwing 83. The average adult male's strength, agility, and vitality were around 5 or 6 points. After strict training, they would reach 8 or 9 points. Sullen's attributes were only 5 or 6 times that of an average person. However, the reality was far from that. His combat power was even more ridiculous. With an outstanding physique, a highly proficient weapon, and powerful skills, a terrifying killing machine was born. Originally, according to the Rise of the Empire game, the hero's skills were not limited to these. However, the game and reality were naturally different. For example, the repeating crossbow skill. In the game, the hero summoned 2 ballistas to attack the enemy. In the real world, this skill was different. It became the ballista manufacturing skill. Many of the skills in the system had undergone various changes, but Sullen's current level was too low, so he hadn't learned most of the skills. After learning it, he could use the materials to build a ballista. Su Len had secretly made one before. The ballista's power was not bad. It had a long shooting range and strong penetrating power. He had experimented with it before. The ballista's arrow could penetrate a knight's plate armor when it was 100 meters away. A mountain bear was even killed by the ballista. Of course, such a powerful weapon had its weaknesses. First of all, the ballista's firing speed was very slow. It could only fire once a minute. In addition, the ballista's movement was also very slow. Its accuracy was passable within 100 meters, but beyond that, it could only rely on luck. The most important thing was that the ballista's production cost was very high. The cost of one ballista was about 300 kinner. It was also very troublesome to maintain it in the future. Therefore, Su Len dismantled the ballista and sold it after making it. In addition to the skills, Sullen's attribute panel had also undergone a lot of changes. For example, in the game, attributes such as strength and vitality would not appear. There was only combat power. Now it was more accurate. Su Len had studied the attributes on the panel. For example, charm did not only refer to the appearance but also some other conditions. Generally, a person with a charm of 10 was considered handsome. Sullen's charm of 18 was completely handsome. In addition to his strong physique, many noble ladies in Kalen City wanted him to be a guardian knight. Su Len had a strong will. If he was weaker, he might have become a rich man. The title of the book would have been changed to My Noble Girlfriends or The Countess Loves Me. The commander's attribute was comprehensive. It determined the morale of the army and the command of the army. A high commander's attribute would increase the morale of the army when he led it. At the same time, the combat power of the army would also be improved. For an ancient army, morale and command played a very important role. Even a well-trained regular army would collapse if the casualties exceeded 30%. If the morale was high, the limit would be 40% or even 50%. After the battle, the caravan began to clean up the battlefield and help the wounded. Su Len walked back to the carriage with his spear. Although he was not injured, the fierce battle made him feel a little tired. Mr. Su Len, thank you for your selfless help. As soon as Su Len returned to the carriage, the manager of the caravan ran over to express his gratitude with a smile. He met this strange traveler in the southern province. He said that he was a noble and wanted to follow the caravan to the northern province. At first, the steward did not take him seriously, mainly because this person did not behave like a noble at all. Moreover, he had never seen a noble traveling such a long distance without even bringing a servant with him. However, it turned out that he was indeed a noble and a powerful one. Su Len put his weapon in the carriage and put his arm around the manager's shoulder. I'm not helping you selflessly. What? The manager looked at Su Len in confusion. Don't pretend to be confused. I saved the entire caravan and let you live without any harm. Aren't you going to pay me to thank me? Su Luen put an arm around the steward's shoulder, then lifted him up and turned him around. He then revealed a sincere smile and said, Thank you. Aren't nobles righteous, brave, and selfless? No matter how poor a noble is, he is still a noble. Moreover, don't fallen nobles pay more attention to noble manners? How can you ask for a reward? Looking at Sullen's caravan, the manager sighed deeply. No wonder he could be a noble. If he had been so shameless back then, he would have had his own business. Feeling the pressure on his shoulder and looking at the battlefield not far away, the manager finally took out a bag of money and handed it over. Sir, please keep it. Su Luen grabbed the bag and tossed it in his hand. It was quite heavy, and he could hear the enticing sounds of kinner banging against it. There were at least 40 or 50 of them. Not bad. Next time we run into something like this, I'll definitely help you deal with it. After receiving the money, Su Len patted the manager's shoulder and promised. Chapter 4. The battlefield was cleaned up quickly. The mercenaries didn't bother to bury the corpses. Instead, they just threw them to the side. They didn't have to worry about a plague since the hyenas would devour the corpses within 2 days. Even the goblins, kobolds, and gnolls would eat the corpses. As for the 2 unlucky bastards who were dragged out of the carriage, their corpses were already gnawed beyond recognition by the time they were found. They could only be burned to ashes and taken away. As for the spoils of war, the bandits in the wilderness were really poor. Most of their weapons were wooden sticks. Only the gnolls had some metal weapons. To humans, the only use for these weapons was to be melted down and reforged. As for the clothes that were stripped off from some unlucky bastard, their colors had long been unrecognizable. They were directly burned with fire. After cleaning up the battlefield, the caravan began to move forward again. However, the atmosphere in the caravan was a little strange. The mercenaries who were bragging and joking with Su Len before now looked at Sullen's carriage with reverence. Everyone couldn't help but lower their voices. Su Len lay back on his horse. He didn't care about the gazes of those people. He was using his consciousness to check the spoils of war this time. He didn't add the 2 attribute points. His current physical fitness was stronger than a knight commander's, so he didn't need to add any points for now. He planned to use the 2 skill points to choose 2 skills later. He opened the system storage. The system storage wasn't big, only 1 cubic meter. There were more than 6,000 kinner, 2 metal ingots, and a silver treasure chest. The 2 metal ingots were spoils of war from the battle. They were refined steel ingots. The quality of the refined steel ingots produced by the system was much better than the well-tempered steel ingots. They could be used to make weapons and tools. Many of the materials for the ballista were made from refined steel ingots. Sullen's weapon was made from iron ingots mixed with some refined steel ingots. It wasn't damaged even after killing the gnolls. These 2 refined steel ingots could be used to make several weapons. Su Len put the refined steel ingots aside and rubbed his hands. He was ready to open the treasure chest. There were a total of 5 types of treasure chests in the system. The lowest grade was black iron, followed by bronze, silver, gold, and finally purple gold. Inside the treasure chest, Xiaofan could obtain various tools from the Legend of the 3 Kingdoms. Of course, he could also obtain skills and mounts. Previously, the highest treasure chest he had opened was only bronze rank. This was the first time he had obtained a silver treasure chest. He clicked on it, and after a burst of light and shadow effects, an item appeared in the box. It looked like a piece of armor. Beast Mask Armor. An armor forged from 100-year refined iron. It is durable yet light. It is a rare treasure armor. Defense plus 15. Additional effect. Body Harden. Hardened body. Reduces damage received. Equipment requirement. Level 12. Sullen's eyes lit up the moment he saw the effect of the Beast Mask Armor. This armor was perfect for him to wear, and it even had the special effect of body hardening. After wearing it, any attack that did not reach a certain level of strength would not be able to break through his defense. Learning the special effect also required skill points, and it was much more expensive than learning the skills. When Su Len first came to this world, he had 3 special effects. However, only one of them could be used, and the other ones were activated by him using skill points. Now that he had the special effect of body hardening, Su Len estimated that if he met the gnolls again, they would not be able to break through his defense. There were only 2 skill points, so Su Len chose to use 1 skill point to learn, Heal. The skill's introduction was very simple. After using it, it would heal the user quickly and restore a small amount of HP. Heal could still be leveled up, but Su Len looked at it. Leveling it up required 2 skill points, so he could only put it aside for the time being. In the following days, the caravan did not encounter any more bandits. Perhaps it was because Su Len had killed too many of them last time. The bandits knew that he was a ruthless character, so they very tacitly hid at the side and let the caravan pass safely. Without the bandits, Su Len did not have a way to quickly gain experience. He could only do some basic training every day. Relying on the little experience he had from Karen, it could be said that leveling up would take years. If he did not leave Karen's city, he could only rely on daily training to gain experience and level up. After following the caravan for another 3 days, the atmosphere in the caravan was a little dull. Su Len was bored and could only lie in the carriage and read the popular novel, Night Aubin. Chapter 1. The landlady finally, on the 3rd day, they saw a black line in the distance. As the carriage moved forward, the line became bigger and bigger. It was the city wall. After seeing the city wall, the entire caravan became excited. Anyone who walked in the wilderness for 10 days or half a month would be very eager to enter the city. The road under their feet soon became flat, and the number of pedestrians on the road gradually increased. An hour later, the full view of Cult City appeared in front of Su Len. Cult City, the most prosperous city in the northern province. The city was first built to defend against the barbarians and orcs in the north. After hundreds of years of development, the city was no longer the front line. But even if it was no longer the front line, one could still vaguely see the past glory of the city. The city wall was more than 10 meters tall and was built with bricks. Every few meters, there would be a protruding lookout tower. These lookouts would play a great role in war. With these lookouts, the city wall became a bastion. The besiegers would be attacked from 3 sides. The moat outside the city wall was directly dredged and transformed. With enough soldiers and food, it would take hundreds of thousands of soldiers a year and a half to take down such a strong city. The caravan slowly moved forward. As they got closer, the mottled traces on the city wall could be seen clearly. The flag with a sword and shield crossed on the city wall fluttered in the wind. That was the symbol of the Savoy family, the overlord of Cult City. The Savoy family was one of the 4 marquis families in the Kingdom of Florence. They also had the right to inherit the throne. Of course, 1/5 of the nobles in the Kingdom of Florence had this right. The caravan slowly moved forward. As the most prosperous city in the northern province, the business here was very prosperous. Furs from the north, gemstones from the Kingdom of Lorraine, iron from the Kingdom of Dwarves, female slaves and dates from the Desert Kingdom were all gathered here. The arrival of large numbers of caravans made this pearl of the northern regions even more prosperous. Every year, Cult City's tax revenue alone was a shocking amount of wealth. 2 teams of armored soldiers stood guard at the city gate. Their cold expressions, shiny armor, and sharp spears were a constant reminder that this city had a powerful defense force. An alarm bell hung on the top right corner of the city gate. Once the bell was rung, a large number of soldiers would come to support within 15 minutes. After paying the entrance tax, the caravan slowly entered the city with a certificate issued by the tax official. Chapter 5. After entering Colt, Sulen parted ways with the caravan. The caravan continued on its way to the market while Sulen headed to the inn first. He pushed open the door of the inn and was greeted by the noise and the smell of ale. The air was a little muddy. It was the afternoon, and the inn's business had just begun. Sulen's arrival did not attract any attention. Under the guidance of a waiter, Sulen went to a room on the second floor and rested for a while before going downstairs. A cup of ale. And something to eat. Sulen came to the counter and tossed a NAR to the waiter. Catching the NAR, the hotel owner took a look at it and put it away with a smile. No problem. Here's your ale. We have roast lamb chop, stewed beef with mushroom and potato, and pork pies. These are all our signature dishes. What would you like to have? A roast lamb chop, please. Please wait a moment. Your order will be here soon. The waiter turned around and shouted. Bill, where the hell are you? Hurry up and give this gentleman a roast lamb chop. Soon, a roast lamb chop was served. Sulen tasted it. It was indeed delicious. At least it was better than sleeping in the wild. After wolfing down the food, Sulen drank a mouthful of ale with a satisfied look. He leaned against the table to digest the food while listening to the people in the inn bragging. Suluan didn't live in a high-end hotel. Most of the people here were mercenaries. At this time, the tavern was almost full. The sound of drinking, playing cards, chatting and the fierce scolding of the maids all mixed together, making the tavern very lively. The mercenaries who had returned safely from their missions all needed to vent their frustrations. They brought news from all over the place. Although most of the news was just the mercenaries bragging, some of it was still useful, such as local prices and information about the surrounding cities. A standard military longsword cost 10 kinner. It was made of well-tempered steel without any extraordinary enchantments. Some black steel was added to increase the weapon's toughness. It was cheaper than the price in Kalen City. It was a half-body chainmail, made with the same quality of well-tempered steel, without any enchantments. The price was 70 gold nars. This price was equivalent to 3 years of savings for a commoner. An ordinary building in the outskirts of Kalen City cost 50 kinner. As for the more advanced plate armor, the price of full-body armor was 400 to 500 kinner. Only knights could afford to use this kind of high-quality plate armor. Moreover, due to the high price of plate armor, most of the knights' plate armor was passed down from their ancestors. Therefore, when you see a knight wearing their ancestral armor on the battlefield, you don't have to be surprised at how much they value their family's honor or tradition. In fact, they just don't have the money to buy a new one. Sulen now had more than 6,000 kinner coins, which could only equip a team of 50 fully armed soldiers at most. Of course, if he used them to recruit those who were only issued with a spear and leather armor, he could recruit 500 or even more. However, the gap between the two sides was huge. Those fully armed soldiers could probably crush the militia with a single charge. Sulen came here to get a piece of land and a title. As a noble, there were many ways to get a title. The simplest was to be reincarnated into a good family, and inherit the title directly from their father when they came of age. Of course, this required you to be the eldest son. The second way was to join the army and gain enough merits on the battlefield. If you didn't die on the battlefield, you could be conferred the title of baron and be given a piece of land by the king when it was time to reward you. The third method was very practical. First, you had to be handsome and in good health. It would be best if you could reach the level of a knight. Then, you had to find a countess whose husband had died. If you could successfully marry her, then you would have both a title and a territory. Sulen had already found a target, but because of Earl Kalen, he had no choice but to bid farewell to the countess with tears in his eyes. The fourth was an expansion order. You had to find a noble who could give out expansion orders and spend money to buy one. Then, you'd bring people to the wastelands and conquer a piece of land. As long as you could survive, you'd become a landed noble and your territory would be much larger than other nobles. High profits naturally came with high risks. Expanding the wastelands required a lot of resources, and not only were there gnolls, kobolds and goblins, there were trolls, ogres, magical beasts, lizard men, orcs, barbarian tribes, and even dragons. If you weren't careful, your territory would be conquered and all your investments would go down the drain. If you were unlucky, you'd even become food for the monsters in the wastelands. If you weren't willing to do any of these, there was another option. That was to become a knight and swear allegiance to a great noble. Then, You'd be granted a knighthood and a knight's manor. Of course, as a knight of this noble, you'd have to serve him for life and fight for him. Su Len naturally didn't want to become someone's vassal. Once he swore allegiance to someone else, it wouldn't just be for one generation, but for all his descendants. As long as they inherited his title, they'd be the vassal of that noble. It wasn't just a lifetime of servitude, but a lifetime of servitude. Of course, this method was very attractive to commoners. As for participating in wars and making contributions in wars, most of the land in the kingdom had been given out. Even if Su Len made enough contributions in wars, the land awarded to him wouldn't be that big. There was a high chance that he'd get a small town, and the area would be pitifully small. He didn't want to risk his life and be rewarded with a small town in a remote area. Don't think it's impossible. With the nature of those nobles, the probability of this ending was as high as 99%. If the first, second, third, and fifth were not suitable, then Sullen's only option was to buy an expansion order. After putting his luggage in his room, Su Len took his noble badge and his long sword and walked out of the inn. He crossed the muddy street and came to the bustling street. He found a well-defined stone on the side of the road. Su Len skillfully rubbed his feet on it a few times to get rid of the mud on the soles of his shoes. His destination this time was the noble parliament in Colt. The expansion order could only be bought there. Other than the expansion order, one could also donate noble status. Of course, this noble status didn't come with a land or a title. It was only an honorary title. Even so, many big merchants were willing to pay for it. Every year, the noble parliament earned a lot of gold coins for the kingdom. It was also an important source of funding for the royal family. The gold coins from the expansion orders and honorary noble status sold by the noble parliament were split equally between the royal family and the local nobles. Chapter 6. The location of the aristocratic parliament was not difficult to find. It was in the square next to the city lord's mansion. The aristocratic parliament's residence was second only to the temple and the city lord's mansion in this city. The whole building was located on a 3-story base. In front of it were 12 large granite pillars with a diameter of 1 meter, and above them was a hemispherical dome. The stone pillars were carved with heroes in the history of the Kingdom of Florence, and the reliefs on the walls were important historical events since the founding of the Kingdom of Florence. The entire aristocratic parliament looked magnificent. At the main entrance were 2 bronze statues riding horses. They were Charlemagne and Wilson. These 2 men were the strongest legendary knights in the history of the kingdom, and also the highest commanders of the kingdom. The 2 statues stood up on their horses, holding long spears and pointing to the front, as if they were leading the thousands of soldiers and horses to battle. The bronze statues were 4 to 5 meters tall, and the carvings were very detailed and lifelike. At first glance, they looked majestic. There was no need to ask to know that they were made by a master. Su Len walked up the steps quickly, and was stopped by a guard when he stood at the gate. "Sir, this is the aristocratic parliament. What can I do for you?" Su Len took out his aristocratic badge and handed it to him. "I want to buy an expansion order." The guard took the aristocratic badge and carefully identified it. The pattern on it was indeed real, and only then did he return the badge to Su Len. "Sir, please come with me." The guard made a gesture of invitation, and then led Su Len into the aristocratic parliament. When he came into the hall, Su Len realized how magnificent the hall was. The whole hall was at least 500 square meters, and its height was more than 10 meters. The whole hall was covered by a hemispherical dome. What was more surprising was that there was not a single pillar in such a spacious hall. On the dome of the hall, there was a mural depicting the founding war. It was also because of this war that the Kingdom of Florence defeated the invaders and gained independence. More than 10 clerks were busy with something in the hall. Su Len and the guards did not disturb these people. Led by the guards, they came to Su Len and came to an exquisitely carved ironwood door. At the sight of this wooden door, Su Len was also shocked. The ironwood of this wooden door was not cheap. It could only be found in the north. It was as hard as iron and was not easily deformed or burned. It was only a quarter of the weight of iron and steel. However, it grew slowly. Generally, it was used to make advanced shields. Such a large piece would take at least 50 years to grow. The guard knocked on the door, but there was no response. After a while, the guard knocked harder. This time, there was finally some movement in the room. "Come in." A lazy voice came from behind the door. The 2 pushed the door open and entered. The room did not look luxurious. There was a mahogany desk, a few bookshelves, and a few high-backed chairs placed opposite each other. At this time, there was a fat middle-aged noble sitting behind the desk. Judging from his dazed eyes, the red mark on the side of his face, and the sparkling liquid on the corner of his lips, he was sleeping just now. Mr. Aria, this gentleman is here to buy an expansion order. The guard pointed at Su Len. Buy an expansion order? Aria looked at Su Len in surprise. He did not even bother to wipe the mucus from the corner of his eyes. He could not help but be surprised. After all, he could not sell more than a few expansion orders in a year. Although the expansion order looked good, there were only a few successful ones. Most of the nobles who bought the expansion order gave up their territory and came back with their tails between their legs. Yes, Mr. Aria. Su Len smiled at Aria. Kid, don't blame me for not reminding you. Don't think that it's not a big deal to expand your territory just because you read a few night novels. You should know that there are at least 800 abandoned territories in the wilderness, if not 1,000, Aria said as he looked at Su Len. Thank you for reminding me, Mr. Aria. I know very well what I am doing, Su Len said calmly. Well, don't blame me for not reminding you when the time comes. Aria shrugged, then took a piece of parchment with a stamp from the bookshelf behind him. He picked up a quill and wrote a line of cursive letters on the blank space of the parchment, then handed it to Su Len. Sign your name and pay 500 kinner. Su Len picked up the quill and signed his name on the parchment, then put a bag of kinnar on the table. Aria put the kinnar on a scale and weighed it. After making sure that the amount was correct, he picked up the stamp and stamped the parchment. Well, kid, take your expansion order and go. Good luck. Su Len took the expansion order and thanked Aria, then turned around and left the noble meeting. Next, he needed to recruit a group of people. Expanding a territory was not an easy task. He needed to prepare a large amount of kinnar. In addition to recruiting a territorial guard, he also needed to buy food, tools, medicine, and so on. When the territory was first stabilized, he also needed to buy slaves for farming. It was not that he did not want to recruit free people, but very few of them were willing to follow the nobles to new territories. Although the nobles would offer all kinds of benefits to free people, very few of them were willing to go. Only bankrupt farmers or unemployed refugees would be tempted. After all, the mortality rate of expanding a territory was too high. Looking at the time, Su Len did not go to the slave market. Instead, he went back to the inn to rest. Early the next morning, Su Len had a simple breakfast at the inn, then spent a silver to rent a carriage and went to the slave market. The slave market was located on the other side of the city. After half an hour, the carriage stopped at the entrance of a lively market. Su Len jumped off the carriage and walked into the slave market. The northern province was located at the border of the kingdom, and there were many demi-human tribes and tribes that were still primitive. Every year, the kingdom's army would engage in local wars with these tribes and tribes, obtaining many captives from these wars. This was also one of the sources of slaves in the slave market. There were also professional slave hunters who went to the wilderness to capture slaves. Of course, there were also unlucky people who couldn't pay their debts and were sold as slaves. Walking into the slave market, Abel was greeted with an unpleasant smell. It was like all kinds of excrement that had been soaked in water and then heated up and fermented. Dirty water flowed on the ground. On both sides of the road, there were some slave traders loudly selling their goods. Behind them, there were many thin and dirty slaves locked in cages. Most of these slaves were naked, with only a dirty rag covering their crotch area. Many of them had whipping marks on their bodies, and their eyes were dull and lifeless. They were the lowest class of slaves. Chapter 7. Seeing Sullen's clothes, the surrounding slave traders all came forward to introduce him. However, Su Len had no interest in these low-level slaves. If he used these people as territorial guards, even a group of goblins and kobolds would be able to defeat them. After sending these slave traders away, Su Len walked deeper into the slave market. Naturally, the slave market didn't only have such low-level slaves. Inside the market, the environment was much better. At least there were no dirty excrements on the road. The slaves here looked clean and tidy, and the slave traders weren't as enthusiastic as before. They would only answer when asked. The slaves here were all trained and could be bought to work. The price was around 3 kinner. If Su Len wanted to buy slaves for farming, these were the best choices. In addition to these slaves, there were also some who were proficient in a skill. These artisan slaves were more expensive, ranging from 5 kinner to 50 kinner. In the tents behind the slave traders were the most popular female slaves in the market. Su Len went in to take a look. The scene inside gave him the feeling of a Japanese movie from his previous life. It was all white and only covered the important parts. The prices ranged from 5 kinner to 200 kinner. As for elven slaves, there were basically none. Ever since the jadeite forest was closed, no elves had appeared on the continent for a long time. Su Len used his strong willpower to get himself out of the tent. He was afraid that if he stayed any longer, he wouldn't be able to resist the urge to buy a few 200 kinner slaves. He forced himself not to look back. Su Len went to the special slaves next to him. The slaves here were all demi-humans. For example, the northern barbarians, centaurs, orcs and so on. Su Len's target was the northern barbarians. The northern barbarians were not a race, but a collective name for the northern barbarians. There were many tribes living in the northern wilderness. These tribes were backward and barbaric. The northern barbarians included the alpine barbarians, the icefield barbarians, and so on. These barbarians looked similar to humans. They were tall and were generally 1.8 meters tall. Some of them were over 2 meters tall. Some barbarians could become elite warriors through systematic training. The nobles of the northern provinces had more or less barbarian soldiers. One shouldn't think that these soldiers were unreliable. In fact, the loyalty of these barbarian soldiers wasn't bad. This was because the barbarians were divided into tribes. Therefore, in the eyes of these barbarians, other than their own tribe, all other tribes were enemies. There was no hesitation when it came to killing people from other tribes. The lowest price for a well-trained barbarian soldier was 35 kinner. The cruel environment had given these barbarians a strong physique. If one didn't take into account the weapons, equipment, and numbers into consideration, ordinary people were no match for these barbarians. A barbarian soldier would need at least 35 kinner. Including the weapons and equipment, a set of qualified barbarian soldier would cost about 150 kinner. Even if I went bankrupt, I would only be able to equip 30 elites. Su Len said with a frown. He only had a little more than 5,000 gold coins left. He kept some to buy other things, and the rest was to buy slaves. 30 elite soldiers. It would be a pipe dream if they wanted to open up a new territory. Unless these elite soldiers were all at the knight level. Knights only needed to be loyal to a big noble to get a manor and noble status. They wouldn't want to open up a new territory with you. As for the remaining kinner, Su Len was going to buy food and equipment for opening up a new territory. In addition to these barbarians, there were also beast men in the slave market. The most popular ones were the cat and fox races. One had to know that the females of these two races were very beautiful. Moreover, those furry ears and tails were more attractive to some people. Su Len's wish was to buy a cat maid and a foxtail maid. However, after considering the issue of territory, he could only reluctantly give up. Just when Su Len was thinking about which kind of slaves to buy, he suddenly saw a group of strange slaves on the side of the road. The other slaves were either strong or skilled. However, these slaves in front of him were interesting. They were all young and old. At a glance, he could tell that these slaves had families to feed. Under normal circumstances, there weren't many slaves with families. This was because these kinds of slaves were not easy to sell. Many people bought slaves because the cost of slaves was low and they could make money for them. However, slaves with families were not cost-effective. If there was labor, it would be fine. If there was no labor, the slave would be a burden to the buyer. It might even be a loss. Of course, it wasn't that slaves with families were not popular. For example, some craftsmen with special skills would buy these slaves along with their families in order to make them work hard. However, these slaves in front of him were not craftsmen. They were a group of barbarians. Barbarians were also a kind of barbarian. Most of them were about 2 meters tall. They were strong and were excellent warriors. Moreover, these barbarians had a special profession. Berserker. Berserkers had the berserk skill. After berserk, a berserker was a killing machine on the battlefield. However, berserkers had a well-known shortcoming. After berserk, they had no discipline at all. They only had one thought: recklessness. This was a disaster for human armies that emphasized discipline. There were once people who coveted the strength of berserkers and incorporated them into the army. As a result, these guys completely ignored their camp after berserk and charged forward. The enemy's formation was messed up by them. As a result, the enemy's general seized the opportunity and sent cavalry to bypass these berserkers and directly attack the enemy. When the marshal was captured, the berserkers were still charging forward. Therefore, from then on, berserkers were rejected from joining the army. Even if they joined, they would be in the cannon fodder camp or the kamikaze camp. These soldiers were used to carry out the charge or cover the rear. Basically, there were no lives in the army. They didn't need to do anything else. It was also because of this that powerful barbarian slaves like berserkers were a little embarrassed. As one-time consumables, they were too expensive. This group of barbarians in front of him was even more so. In addition to the warriors, there were also many old people and children. This made this group of barbarians very unpopular. Although these berserkers couldn't participate in army battles, they were very suitable for small-scale battles. Sullen's territory was also very suitable. In any case, the tribes in the wilderness also had no discipline. Both sides were at the same level. No one was worse than the other. At this time, it depended on personal strength. These barbarian berserkers weren't afraid of anyone in a battle of the wilderness. There was another more important reason, and that was that these berserkers were very cheap. This was the main reason. Chapter 8. Khan had been having a headache recently. As a slave trader, he had a batch of slaves that had fallen into his hands recently. Just last month, he had been cheated by someone. Last month, when he had just entered the trade, a slave trader had sold his slaves to other slave traders because he owed a huge debt and could not pay it back. There were more than 100 barbarians among them. At that time, these barbarians had families to feed. Although they were strong, no one cared about them. In the end, he had gotten a bargain. In Khan's opinion, it would be easier to control them if they had families to feed. With the old, weak women and children in his hands, these barbarians would not betray him. Selling these powerful barbarians to the nobles as private guards was definitely the best choice. Therefore, he spent more than half of his kinnar to buy this group of barbarians. After buying this group of barbarians, Khan began to promote this group of barbarians everywhere. However, the results made him feel as if he had fallen into an ice cave. No one was willing to buy these barbarians. Even if he sold them at a price lower than what he had paid for them, no one cared. There were more than 100 barbarians, and each one had a bigger appetite than the other. In a month, he had not sold a single slave. Instead, he had lost a large amount of food. After asking around, he found out that because the barbarians had gone berserk, no one would buy them as guards. This meant that this batch of slaves had fallen into his hands. What made him even more worried was that he was almost out of money. If he could not sell this batch of slaves, he might have to go home and inherit his father's business at the end of the month. His bold words of wanting to start a business were all for naught. "Are you selling these slaves?" Su Len looked at the slave trader who was in a daze and asked. "Yes, of course. You want to buy slaves?" Khan stared at Su Len with shining eyes. His gaze made Sullen's hair stand on end. "Yes, how much are these slaves?" Su Len pointed at the group of barbarians next to him. "Sir, you really have a good eye. My slaves are definitely the best in the slave market. You see, such a strong warrior only costs 10 kinnar. You can't find a slave with a lower price than mine in the entire slave market." Khan enthusiastically introduced Su Len to him, fearing that he would run away. Su Len looked at these barbarians. About a quarter of them were male warriors, and the rest were old, weak, women, and children. The male warriors had many wounds on their bodies. At a glance, one could tell that they were elite warriors. Although this slave trader was full of nonsense, these slaves were really good. 10 kinnar? Are you still asleep? Su Len glanced at Khan with a faint smile. "Are you treating me as a rich guy? These berserkers are completely useless. You actually want 10 kinnar? Keep them for yourself." After that, Su Len turned and was about to leave. Seeing that the slave trader was about to leave, Khan didn't care about anything else. He grabbed Su Len and said, "Sir, the price is negotiable. Don't be in a hurry to leave." "Why don't I leave? Waiting to be cheated by an unscrupulous merchant like you?" Su Len struggled to break free from Khan's arm. 7 kinnar. 7 kinnar. Khan quickly said when he felt the struggling strength in his hand. 7 kinnar? If this price is still acceptable, but I only want those adult warriors. Sulen stopped struggling and said. This. Khan was a little confused. Sir, those women and children are the warriors' families. If they don't have their families, they won't be able to work for you with peace of mind. What's the use of these old and weak women and children? I have to spend money to feed them. I don't have so much food to feed them. Since you insist on selling them together, you can keep them. After that, Sulen once again pretended to leave. 6 kinnar. Seeing that Sulen was about to leave, Khan helplessly closed his eyes and said unwillingly, but these old and weak women and children will be sold together with these warriors. Sulen immediately agreed. Hearing Sulen's quick agreement, Khan didn't know how to react for a moment. There are a total of 126 people here. 6 kinnar for each person, which adds up to 756 kinnar. This is the payment for the goods. You can count it. Sulen took out a bag of money and counted some from it. After that, he threw the remaining kinnar and the bag of money to Khan, not giving him a chance to regret. After receiving the heavy gold coins and seeing that Sulen paid so quickly, he knew that he had made a loss this time. However, he was in a hurry to sell the slaves, so Sulen took advantage of his weakness. After selling those burdens, Khan didn't feel happy at all. He had lost at least 700 gold coins in this deal. He had bought these slaves for 10 kinnar. Then, he had to provide food for these slaves and rent the space. These expenses almost made him bankrupt. Although this deal was a loss, at least he still had 700 gold coins. As long as he was serious and followed his business theory, he would be able to earn it back quickly. Then, Khan's business empire would be set sail. After comforting himself in his heart, Khan quickly completed the deal with Sulen and gave the barbarian slave contracts to Sulen. After putting away the slave contracts, Sulen led the barbarians out of the slave market. With so many slaves, he needed to find a place to settle them down as soon as possible. Fortunately, Sulen was also a noble. He quickly bought an unused military camp from the city hall. This military camp was located in a remote location. It had at least 100 years of history. In the past, Cult was the front line, so there were many standing troops. Later, as the territory expanded, this place was no longer the front line. The standing troops were also disbanded, so the military camp was naturally empty. Many unused military camps had been torn down due to the development of the city. This one was only preserved because of its remote location. As Sulen expected, this military camp was in ruins. Many of the roofs in the camp had collapsed. Fortunately, they did not skimp on the construction. The main body of the building was quite sturdy, and the area of the camp was large enough. As long as the roof was repaired, it would be habitable. Sulen contacted a merchant to buy some materials and hired a craftsman to repair the house. He then went to the training ground in the camp, ready to chat with the slaves he just bought. The barbarians were called barbarians because of their strength. Unlike the Florentines, barbarians were generally around 2.1 meters tall. Sulen's 1.9 meters was already very outstanding among the Florentines. He also practiced martial arts all year round, so his muscles were very strong. However, compared to these barbarians, he was like a little brother. Any adult barbarian could easily crush him in terms of height and muscle. On the training ground, 126 barbarians stood there quietly, staring coldly at Sulen. Although they were slaves, they did not seem to care much about Sulen. Chapter 9. It was easy to win the respect of the barbarians. All he had to do was defeat them. It was also easy to gain their favor. All he had to do was drink with them. Most of the barbarians had simple thoughts. They were not as cunning as the Florentines. Of course, there were exceptions. You should know that I have bought you. From today onwards, you are my slaves. Sulen took out the slave contract and waved it. The barbarians did not say anything. Sulen was not surprised by this. After all, no one wanted to be a slave. You should thank me. If I didn't buy you, you would only end up in the cannon fodder camp. Didn't you buy us to use us as cannon fodder? A barbarian separated his companions, walked out from behind, and stood in front of Sulen. Sulen raised his head and looked at the barbarian. He did not like to talk to people with his head raised. The barbarian in front of him was already 2 meters tall. Even among the barbarians, he was a burly man. Su Len was like a stunted child in front of him. More importantly, this barbarian was very agile. He did not feel clumsy at all. He gave Su Len the feeling of a cheetah in the northern wilderness. Su Len quietly took 2 steps back and adjusted his posture. Finally, he did not have to raise his head to look at him. Of course not. If I wanted to use you as cannon fodder, why would I buy the old, weak, women and children? You don't plan to use them to threaten us as cannon fodder. The barbarian was silent for a moment and said in a low voice, I am not a soldier. I have nothing to do with the military. Su Len spread his hands and said, Besides, I spent so much money not to let you be cheap cannon fodder on the battlefield. I am a noble. I just bought a development order. I need a group of soldiers to follow me to develop my territory in the wilderness. This is the reason why I bought you. Of course, it is very dangerous to develop a territory. However, I can promise that after my territory is developed successfully, your status as a slave will be revoked. You will also become a free person in my territory. Sounds good, but how can we trust you? You have no choice but to trust me. Su Len smiled and said, Of course, I can use my reputation as a noble to guarantee that as long as the territory is successfully developed, I will fulfill my promise. In addition, during the initial stages of developing the territory, I can let your family live here. As the most prosperous city in the northern provinces, this place is also the safest. I will provide them with food every month. Of course, you can send someone to supervise every time. After hearing Sullen's conditions, the barbarian, who should be the leader, had already agreed. This was the best outcome. Sullen's method was acceptable to both parties. Leaving the old, weak, women and children in the city could ensure their safety and also give Su Len peace of mind. If he brought them to the wilderness to develop a territory, Su Len was worried that these barbarians would escape when he wasn't paying attention. After all, they had lived in the wilderness before. We agree. The barbarian grinned, revealing a smile that was uglier than crying. My name is Johnson. I come from the violent bear tribe, but it no longer exists. My name is Su Len. Su Len nodded and said, Now, you will clean up this camp. You will live here temporarily. After I buy you weapons, we will set off to the wilderness to develop a territory. Next, more than 100 barbarians joined in cleaning up the camp. The speed of clearing the camp suddenly increased. Although there were many women and children among these barbarians, these women and children were not weak at all. Although the female barbarians were not as strong as the male barbarians, they were still very strong compared to the Florentines. Have you seen a weak woman carrying 100 or 200 pounds of garbage and walking back and forth? There were also underage children. Each of them was not much worse than an adult Florentine. By night, all the barracks in the camp had been repaired. Su Len rested in the inn. He had to continue to prepare the materials for the development of the camp tomorrow. This group of barbarian warriors added up to 35 people, and each of them was quite strong. They were better than the slave warriors he wanted to buy before. With so many people, he spent more than 700 kinner. This way he saved a lot of money. The warriors in the slave market cost about 30 kinner each, but their combat power was average. Even if the barbarians did not go berserk, they could still easily beat them. If they went berserk, it was not a problem to beat 5 or 6 of them. When the Florentines fought against the barbarian warriors, they relied more on numbers and weapons. Even if the heavily armed soldiers were strong against the barbarians who wore animal skins and used stones or wooden sticks, it was just a last-ditch struggle. In addition, the Florentines were not powerless. Whether it was knights or wizards, they could deal with these barbarians. With more than 4,000 kinner, it would not cost much to buy weapons for these barbarians. As for armor, 1 leather armor per person would be enough. What? Why didn't they buy iron armor? That thing was so expensive. It started at hundreds of kinner. Su Len was not so extravagant as to equip these barbarians with heavy armor. Perhaps he would consider these things when he had more money in the future. Right now, the most important thing was the issue of territory. Occupying a territory and clearing out all the monsters in it wouldn't be difficult for Su Luen to do so. The difficult part was defending this territory. After all, if he couldn't guarantee the safety of this territory, and if no free people came to farm it, it would be a rootless tree that couldn't stand on its own. Only when there were free people could Su Len collect taxes. With taxes, his territory could continue to develop. Otherwise, he would not be able to last long if he only relied on his endless investment. For the early development of his territory, he would need to buy a large number of slaves. After all, it was difficult to recruit free people in a new territory, so he could only use slaves. The construction of the territory also required a large number of slaves. He could not ask the barbarians to build houses. These barbarians would probably just build shacks. Expecting them to build houses was better than expecting pigs to fly. Kalt was the largest city in the north. There were all kinds of resources here. Su Len could buy all the resources he needed to develop his territory, and the price was relatively cheap. If he was in a border city, he might not even be able to buy all the resources. Even if he could, it would probably cost a lot more. Carriages, food, weapons, seeds, farming tools, tents, and building materials were all bought and piled up in the camp. Among them, food was the most abundant. This was because he had to prepare at least a year's worth of food. Even if he developed his territory this year, there would not be any production. He could only be self-sufficient when the food matured next year. Chapter 10. Originally, Su Luen thought that the 5,000 gold nars he borrowed from his cheap brother, who didn't even deserve to have a name, was already a lot. But when he really got here, he realized that the 5,000 gold nars was only enough for the initial investment. 5,000 kinnar was equivalent to a city's tax for a year, but it was only enough to support 100 regular soldiers. Other than some tattered clothes, the barbarians didn't have anything else. Su Len even had to prepare clothes for them. He brought the group of brutes to the west market of Kalt City. It was the biggest market in the city. Needless to say, bringing along 32-meter-tall burly men to swagger through the streets was truly outrageous. Most of these barbarians were topless, and each of them had scars on their bodies. Each of them had bulging muscles and tattoos on their bodies. Coupled with their stoic faces, their aura was truly tyrannical. Walking on the street, a 3-meter-wide barrier formed around them. Su Len looked like a hedonistic young master with a group of bullies. Unfortunately, he didn't meet any hot-blooded youths who liked to fight for justice. Su Len even prepared to teach them a lesson and let them experience the harsh beating of society. When they arrived at the West Market, Su Len brought the barbarians to the shop where he had pre-ordered the goods. As the kinnar was spent like flowing water, carts after carts of goods were brought back. Even the barbarians had changed into new clothes. Those rough-looking men were wearing brand-new leather armor and holding sharp axes. Their palms, which were as big as palm leaf fans, were gently rubbing against the skin. Their expressions were as if they were caressing the skin of their lover. That's not right. Su Luen dared to bet that even their wives had never enjoyed such treatment before. Su Len chose two-handed axes for the barbarians. Of course, the axes were made according to the size of the Florentine people. However, the barbarians could lift them with one hand. One could imagine how it would be like if a group of barbarians wielded the axes, activated their berserk state, and charged into the enemy's formation and swung the axes like a windmill. Flesh and blood splattered everywhere, and corpses littered the ground. Especially when facing undisciplined and unarmored monsters in the wilderness, the barbarians were like human meat grinders. Their killing speed was much faster than regular soldiers. Of course, they weren't without weaknesses. The berserk barbarians had their rationality lowered to the lowest. They could only distinguish between friend and foe. Although they were powerful, they had no discipline at all. After the berserk state ended, they would enter a weakened state. During the weakened state, the barbarians' condition would drop by 50% and their stamina would drop to 30%. They were like lambs waiting to be slaughtered. Many times, the barbarian berserkers suffered heavy casualties because they rushed too far and got surrounded. Once the berserk state ended, they would be easily killed. It wasn't that no one wanted to solve this problem. Whether it was the Kingdom of Florence, the Kingdom of Gallant, or even the Alans Federation in the south, they had all studied this problem. After all, the barbarians were still very powerful when they went berserk. However, they soon discovered that there was no way to solve this problem. If the barbarians maintained their rationality, they wouldn't be able to maintain their berserk state. If they wanted to maintain their berserk state, they would have to lower their rationality. The experiment fell into an endless cycle. In the end, all the countries gave up on this thankless experiment. After spending a day, Su Len finally transported all the resources back. As for whether he was cheated or not, there was no need to worry. Su Len purposely brought more than 30 strong barbarians to intimidate the merchants. If the price they offered was unreasonable or there were problems with the resources, he wouldn't mind letting them have a taste of their own medicine. After preparing all the supplies, Su Len left a month's worth of food for the barbarian women and children in the camp. Then, he led the convoy out of Cult City. To use an old saying, the wheel of history had begun to roll. After leaving Cult City, Sullen's group headed northeast. There were more than a dozen cities of various sizes to the north of Cult City. There were many human settlements around Cult City. This was the actual area under Cult City's control. If Su Len wanted to expand his territory, he could only go further away. After leaving Cult City's area of control, the road became bumpy again. The north was different from the south. There were large stretches of wilderness between the cities. There were many bandits, goblins, kobolds, gnolls, and even humans living in the wilderness. Every once in a while, the garrisons of the surrounding cities would conduct a cleanup in the wilderness near the cities. Their goal was to reduce the number of these creatures. It was unrealistic to say that they had completely cleaned up the area. Goblins and kobolds were like weeds in the wilderness. Moreover, their reproductive abilities were too strong. They were born in groups every time. Even if there was no food, they could still survive by eating grass or even soil. Sullen's group was huge. There were 30 carriages fully loaded with goods. In order to transport these goods, Su Len specially hired a mercenary group. The entire group had more than 100 people. With such a large caravan, the smaller tribes in the wilderness didn't dare to attack at all. They didn't have the ability to do so either. This also made Sullen's plan to take advantage of this opportunity to farm monsters go down the drain. After traveling in the wilderness for 5 days, Sullen's group finally arrived at Blackstone City, the northernmost city of the Kingdom of Florence. It was a small border city with only 5,000 permanent residents. However, it had 1,000 soldiers. The city wasn't large either. Su Len didn't see any human settlements outside the city. It was obviously a fortress city. The caravan didn't enter the city. They went around the city and officially entered the wilderness. From then on, Sullen's group didn't encounter any human cities. At this point, the real test had just begun. After passing Blackstone City, the number of monsters in the wilderness increased significantly. Su Len had found that there were many eyes peeping around the caravan. However, these monsters hiding in the dark didn't directly attack. As the caravan went deeper into the wilderness, there were more and more tails around the caravan. By the 4th day in the wilderness, the number of tails around the caravan had swelled to hundreds. This number was enough to clean up once. He was going to let these barbarians try their axes and see the combat power of these barbarians. In fact, after he officially left the city with these barbarians, his system had already sent a notification. Su Len had an army of 35 people. There were also the attributes of this army on the system panel. Northern Barbarian Guard. Number, 35 unit. Barbarian. Morale, 85. After these barbarians joined Sullen's army, they directly surpassed the barbarian soldiers and became second-level barbarian warriors. The leader, Johnson, was a barbarian warrior and also a hero unit. Chapter 11. The barbarians were indeed powerful. Level 1 barbarian soldiers already had the sturdy trait. Once they became barbarian warriors, they would gain the berserk skill. Only then would they be qualified to be called berserkers. Sullen's team only had one barbarian warrior. Other than sturdy and berserk, the barbarian warrior also had endurance and whirlwind slash. Only barbarian warriors were qualified to be killing machines. Of course, this was only for low-level monsters. Sturdy. Beginner, you are born with a strong body. The power of your bloodline gives you a strong physique. Your strength and physique are permanently increased by 2 points. Berserk. After a long battle, you will awaken the power in your bloodline. When you are angry or excited, you can enter a berserk state. Pain is reduced by 70%, strength is increased by 20%, movement speed is increased by 10%, and intelligence is reduced by 50%. Endurance. After a long period of training and battle, your body has gradually surpassed the limits of a normal person. You will gain a strong life force. Normal injuries will be weakened. Permanently increase your HP by 10 points, your physique by 10 points, and your physique recovery speed is increased by 20%. Whirlwind slash. With your body as the axis, You can spin 180 degrees or more to quickly swing your weapon. The weapon will be imbued with a weak sword aura, causing great damage to enemies around you. Because there were no archers in the army, the barbarians were not skilled in archery, so Su Luan equipped them with axes as long-range weapons. Sure enough, these barbarians had a special preference for axes. They could hit the target at a distance of 30 paces without fail. Stop! Su Len pulled on the reins. The team quickly stopped. Johnson! I'm here, boss. Take your men and clean up those tails as fast as you can. Understood. Johnson rubbed his shiny bald head and grinned, revealing a row of white teeth. He then turned around and yelled, "Brothers, get your weapons. It's time to work." Get your weapons. The other barbarians shouted. Under Johnson's lead, 35 barbarians picked up their axes and charged towards the back of the convoy. The barbarians' formation was messy. Even the new recruits of Cult who had undergone 3 months of training were more orderly than them. However, if one underestimated them, they would suffer a great loss. 30 steps ahead. Prepare your axes. Throw freely. The barbarians were tall and long. Before the kobolds, goblins, and gnolls could react, they were already 30 steps away. It was already too late for them to react. A gnoll who looked like a leader hurriedly commanded the monsters to attack. They did not think that a mere 30 humans would be a match for them. Their huge advantage in numbers had inflated their ego. More than 30 hand axes flew into the crowd of monsters. The first one to be hit was a tall gnoll. One of the hand axes hit its head, and the huge force almost cut its head in half. Half of the axe's blade had sunk into the gnoll's head. Even an ogre would not be able to withstand such a serious injury, let alone a gnoll. Due to the close distance and the fact that the gnolls, goblins, and kobolds were standing close together, there was no time to dodge. The monsters in front were hit one after another. The luckier ones only had their limbs chopped off and fell to the ground, wailing in pain. The unluckier ones had their heads cut open and were sent back to the underworld before they could even scream. 2 rounds of throwing axes stunned the monsters. At least a third of them died on the spot, and many more were injured. After 2 rounds of throwing, the barbarians charged into the crowd of monsters. Equipped with new equipment, the barbarians displayed their overwhelming strength against the wasteland monsters that looked like beggars. Facing the wooden sticks and claws of the monsters, the barbarians did not dodge at all. They charged straight at the gnolls and goblins. The powerful force sent the gnolls and goblins flying. Some of the weaker ones had their chests caved in and blood gushed out of their mouths. Before they could land on the ground, they were already dead. After sending the enemies flying, the barbarians did not stop their charge. They raised their sharp axes and slashed at the monsters. The sharp blades cut through flesh like they were cutting through cloth. The wooden sticks and claws had no effect at all. The gnolls, goblins, and kobolds fell in rows as if they were mowing grass. Blood and flesh splattered everywhere, dyeing the ground red. This was especially true for the bald leader. He swung a battle axe the size of a millstone and drove a windmill into the crowd. Wherever he went, gnolls, goblins, and even kobolds were all cut open. Behind him, a bloody path paved with broken limbs was left behind. The heavy casualties scared the wasteland bandits out of their wits. The surviving bandits fled in all directions as fast as they could, afraid that they would be cut down by the barbarians if they were too slow. The entire battle, from beginning to end, only took a few minutes. The barbarians chased after the bandits for a while before returning. The leather armor and axes slowed them down quite a bit. They could not catch up with the frightened bandits at all. Next, the barbarians began to clean up the battlefield. The axes Su Len gave them were not disposable items. Each of them was made of fine iron and cost a kinnar. Su Len was not rich enough to throw away dozens of kinnar in a single battle. The wasteland bandits were as poor as ever. They did not have any spoils of war. It was a thankless task. As soon as the battle ended, Su Len received a system notification. A glorious victory. Your army has just won a battle. In this battle, you have obtained an item. Iron Ingot X1. Battle damage, 0, enemy annihilation. 87 experience gained, 576, experience gained, 300. The other attributes did not change, but the morale of the army rose from 85 to 100. After the battlefield was cleaned up, Johnson came to report the results. Did anyone get hurt? Boss, this equipment is amazing. Only 2 of us got some superficial wounds, but it's not a big deal. We're used to it, Johnson said excitedly as he patted the leather armor on his body. Did you pick up all the axes? Yes, all of them. Johnson and the other barbarians were very careful with their weapons. These metal weapons were something they did not even dare to dream of. In the past, their tribe was similar to the bandits they had just defeated. The best weapon they had was a rusty axe. Now they treated these weapons like family heirlooms. Chapter 12. Su Len was not surprised by the results of the battle. To him, this was just a normal performance. The difference between the weapons of both parties was like heaven and earth. It was just like how in the history of Sullen's previous life, other than the fact that he was well trained, he had to rely on his equipment to suppress his opponents. The convoy started to move forward once again. After this round of cleansing, there were no longer any traces of people spying on them. The mercenaries in the convoy also became respectful toward the noble, Su Len. Even the speed of the convoy increased by a lot. After moving forward in the wilderness for 5 days, the convoy had already entered the depths of the wilderness. They were now at least 200 kilometers away from the nearest city, Blackrock City. According to the requirements of the expansion order, Su Len could only designate territories that were more than 100 kilometers away from cities. In fact, he had already exceeded this requirement, and the extra area was reserved for the future development of his territory. The expansion order did not specify the size of the territory. Theoretically speaking, as long as one had the ability, one could freely enclose land in the wilderness. Of course, this was only in theory. In fact, ever since the expansion movement started, the largest piece of land developed had not exceeded 300 li. It was because the deeper one went into the wilderness, the stronger the monsters would be. It was said that there had been people who had seen huge dragons in the wilderness. Of course, this news had not been verified. However, it was true that there were land dragons in the depths of the wilderness. This news had been verified by the blood of a noble who had developed the territory. This unlucky noble had barged into the land dragon's territory when he was developing his territory. Then, just as he had started to set up camp, over 200 land dragons had razed his territory to the ground. Even the weakest of land dragons was a middle-grade magical creature, and the stronger ones had inherited the terrifying ability to spit out dragon's breath. Even conferred knights would have to take a detour around such land dragons. Only legendary knights would be able to deal with such magical creatures. In the end, the convoy stopped at a slope surrounded by 2 rivers. Although this slope was called a slope, its highest point was only 5 to 6 meters higher than the surrounding plains. The area was not small, and the 2 rivers surrounded it, forming a flat alluvial plain. Due to the silt, the land here was exceptionally fertile. It was not like the other lands in the wilderness, which could only become mature fields after a few years of cultivation. The area of the plain was not small. Su Len estimated that if the entire plain was reclaimed, it would be at least 50,000 to 60,000 acres. As long as they could gain a foothold here, it would not be a problem to feed tens of thousands of people with this land. This land could be called a treasure land. Su Len quickly decided to build his castle here. In theory, as long as Su Len built a camp here, the surrounding area would be his territory. As for how much he could control, that would depend on his army. Of course, the natives of this land did not recognize the rules of the humans. If they wanted to truly control the territory, they would need a powerful army to reason with them. In the natural world, lions and tigers would leave their scents at the edge of their territory, such as peeing, to warn other lions and tigers not to cross the boundary. As for the humans and natives, they naturally couldn't use this method. The only way was through war. If you win, you'll be the boss of this land. If you lose, you'll get the hell out of here, or you won't even have the chance to run. Since they had decided to build a camp here, the caravan began to get busy. Soon, a temporary camp made of tents was set up on the desolate riverbank. Su Len planned to build his future castle on a slope by the riverbank. That slope was the highest point of the plain. Su Len had just checked it and found that the soil there was hard and suitable for building a city. Although the wilderness looked desolate, it was actually very rich in resources. There were many fish in the 2 rivers. This news made Su Len very happy. It meant that he could save a lot of food. The mercenaries in the caravan had rich experience in camping in the wilderness. The barbarians were also experts in wilderness survival. Soon, they caught many fish from the river. After a simple cleaning, the fresh fish were thrown into the pot. The barbarians found some wild onions, wild ginger, and other spices in the wilderness and cooked them with salt. Not long after, a rich aroma floated above the camp. Even Su-Len could feel his stomach churning. 10 days after leaving Colt, Su-Len once again enjoyed a delicious meal. This was the plain between the Red Sand River and the White Water River. The abundant water source made this land very fertile. The meandering river was like a long snake spiraling across the land. On both sides of the river were patches of dense reeds. From time to time, some wild ducks and waterbirds would fly out of the reeds. The whole scene was very peaceful. On a slope in the distance, a simple camp was being built quickly. Other than building a wall, Su-Len had to build enough warm houses before winter. The wilderness was very cold in winter. The cold from the extreme north could freeze goblins and kobolds into ice sculptures. Humans were no exception. Su-Len had brought more than 100 people with him. Other than the barbarians, the rest were mercenaries and some slaves he had bought. With only these people, even if Su-Len let the mercenaries and barbarians join in the construction, it would be very difficult to build a camp in such a short time. However, it was not impossible. The wilderness had enough manpower. Although the goblins and kobolds were weak in battle, they could still carry stones, cut down trees, and dig for foundations. So after the fence of the camp was erected, Su-Len took a team of barbarians to catch slaves. As for the mercenaries, they stayed here to guard the camp in case it was attacked when Su-Len was not there. Although the mercenaries were not as strong as the barbarians, they could still rely on the fence to defend. With the protection of the fence, they could hold on for a while even if there were gnolls, trolls, and ogres. As soon as the camp gave the signal, Su-Len would quickly lead the barbarians to help. Soon, Su-Len led the barbarians to clean up the wilderness within a 5-kilometer radius with the camp as the center. The goblins, kobolds, and gnolls in the surrounding area were unlucky. The surrounding area was full of small tribes. In the face of more than 30 fully armed barbarians, they could not resist at all. Often, a single charge from the barbarians would cause the entire tribe to collapse. However, Su-Len did not want to kill the enemy this time. He wanted to capture slaves. The goblins and kobolds that were escaping in all directions were not easy to capture. Su-Len could only split the barbarians into 2 teams. He led one team to attack, and Johnson led the other team to ambush them in advance. This way, they could capture as many slaves as possible. Chapter 13. Su-Len didn't know much about battle. After all, he hadn't received proper military education since he was young. He was just a normal university student in his previous life. He wasn't a military student, and he didn't serve in the army. His knowledge of military command came from movies, as well as his interactions with this world. However, after experiencing the era of information explosion, Su-Len also learned a lot about tactics and strategies from other channels, even if he only learned by analogy. Although they were still on par with each other, bullying these barbarians wasn't a problem at all. Soon, Su-Len discovered a small tribe. It was a kobold tribe, and there were more than 200 adult kobolds. The entire tribe was built on an empty plot of land, and they used large amounts of reeds and wood to build huts. The entire camp was dirty and messy, and Su-Len could smell an unpleasant stench from afar. Warriors crushed them. The barbarians' strength was in breaking through enemy lines. As for formation and defense, they really didn't know that. Therefore, in this situation, commanding didn't have much of an effect. Perhaps the only use was to attack. After Su-Len arranged for a team to intercept the kobolds, he led the remaining barbarians in an attack. The kobolds didn't panic at the barbarians' charge. Instead, they rushed forward excitedly. In the wilderness, the courage of the barbarians was proportional to their numbers. The more of them there were, the more courageous they became. When they saw that there were only a dozen of them, they bared their yellowed fangs. Unfortunately, they were facing Sullen's barbarian warriors. These fully armed barbarians didn't care about the kobolds at all. Raise morale. Charge. Su-Len used his military tactics on his own troops. The already high morale of 90 immediately rose to 100. The barbarians were very fast. Under Sullen's lead, a dozen barbarians quickly approached the kobold camp. Hand axes. Attack at will. Under Sullen's orders, the barbarians picked up the hand axes at their waists and swung them at the area where the kobolds were concentrated. After 2 rounds of hand axes, they created a gap in the area where the kobolds were concentrated. After creating an opening, Su Len took the lead and led the barbarian warriors forward. With sullen strength, he could clear out the entire camp by himself. With the addition of a dozen barbarians, it was like a hot knife through butter, killing all the kobolds he encountered along the way. The battle ended quickly. Sullen's strength had scared the kobolds out of their wits. After only a few minutes of contact, the kobolds began to crumble. After defeating the group of kobolds, Su Len stopped attacking. His main goal this time was not to kill, but to capture slaves. If he killed all the kobolds, who would build his territory for him? Therefore, after defeating them, Su Len consciously drove the kobolds to the place where he had set up an ambush. Leaving a few people behind to clean up the battlefield, Su Len led the rest of the barbarian warriors to chase the kobolds away. The kobolds were not very fast. Even if they were fully armed, the barbarians could still easily keep up. After all, the kobolds were tall and had long legs. One step was equivalent to several steps. They spread out in formation and drove the kobolds in a semicircle in the direction Su Len had set. The barbarians did not chase after them, but maintained a distance of 20 to 30 meters. If they deviated from the path, Su Len would lead the barbarians to correct them. After running for 2 kilometers, the kobolds were driven to the predetermined location. At this time, the kobolds were so tired that they wanted to stick their tongues out. As natives of the wilderness, the kobolds were not known for their endurance. These guys were the lowest level in the wilderness, just like the goblins. Johnson, who had set up an ambush in front, had set up many traps. When the kobolds arrived, the ropes were pulled up one by one. The kobolds running in front did not even have time to react before they fell to the ground. The kobolds at the back wanted to stop, but they were forcefully pushed forward by the kobolds behind them. As a result, rows of kobolds fell to the ground one after another. These exhausted kobolds could not even get up after falling down. They were immediately covered by the barbarians' nets. The remaining kobolds who reacted could not escape. When they stopped and wanted to change directions, they found themselves surrounded by barbarians. In the end, these kobolds trembled in fear and begged for their lives on the ground. Su Len asked the barbarians to tie these kobolds up with ropes. In order to prevent them from escaping, he strung them up. After realizing that the demons in front of them had no intention of killing them, the kobolds were very cooperative. A few of them even helped the barbarians tie themselves up with ropes. In the end, Su Len caught more than 160 kobolds. These were not seriously injured. As for the seriously injured ones, they had already been killed when they were tied up. Su Len did not have any medicine to treat the kobolds. After cleaning up the battlefield, Su Len led the barbarians to drive the kobolds back to the camp. These kobolds were scared out of their wits and did not dare to resist. They obediently followed Sullen's orders and walked towards the camp. In reality, they could not run even if they wanted to. Dozens of kobolds were strung up in a row. With the kobolds' discipline, if they tried to escape, the entire row of kobolds would fall to the ground. Kobolds were called kobolds, but they did not look like dogs. Instead, they looked more like lizards. They did not have the fur of gnolls. Instead, they had black or brown scales. They were short and afraid of strong light. Because their language sounded like dog barking, they were called kobolds. However, they claimed that they were descendants of dragons and had the blood of dragons. Many people thought this was a joke. However, kobolds did no dragon language. It was just that their dragon language was very bad. Furthermore, kobolds were also oviparous. Some mutated kobolds had spell-like abilities and became kobold sorcerers. However, the appearance of kobold sorcerers pulled down the bottom line of all spellcasters. Su Len and the others did not find any kobold sorcerers in the kobold tribe. Even in the human world, only 1 in 1,000 people had the talent to become a spellcaster. The probability of kobolds becoming a kobold sorcerer was not higher than humans. Among all the human races, elves had the highest probability of becoming a spellcaster. Almost all elves knew how to cast spells. However, elves had not appeared for hundreds of years. Chapter 14. When Su Len brought the kobold slaves back to the camp, it was already time for dinner. The barbarians herded the group of kobold slaves and locked them in a simple fence outside the camp. The dinner was sumptuous. There was a lot of fish in the nearby river, so it only took a little effort to get enough fish. The fragrant fish soup paired with the black bread made for a decent dinner. The black bread was bought from Colt. When it was fresh out of the oven, It tasted pretty good. Once it cooled, it became hard enough to be used as a wooden stick. It tasted dry and unpalatable, but there was a benefit to it. It could be stored for a long time without going bad. He sliced the rye bread and soaked it in the delicious and scalding fish soup. The rich soup soon softened the cold and hard rye bread. After absorbing the delicious fish soup, it became soft and delicious. Coupled with the smooth and tender fish meat, his hungry stomach was quickly satisfied. Su Len put down the big bowl in his hand and rubbed his belly comfortably. Johnson, give the rest of the fish soup and fish bones to the kobolds. Don't let them starve to death. Creatures like kobolds didn't have high requirements for food. Even some leftovers were enough for them. A few barbarians carried a few buckets of fish soup and leftover fish bone black bread to the fence. The kobolds, whose eyes were glowing from hunger, also became restless. If it wasn't for the barbarians leaving a deep impression on them during the day, they would have rushed up to snatch the food. Su Len sent a few barbarians to maintain order and let the kobolds line up to get their food. However, the kobolds didn't have the concept of lining up at all. This was simple. They didn't have the concept of lining up. Each of them was over 2 meters tall with a hardwood stick as thick as an arm. When they saw the kobolds who didn't line up according to the rules, they would hit them with the stick. Soon, the noisy kobolds lined up in a crooked line to get their food. The next morning, Su Len arranged for the kobolds to work. Under the whip of the barbarians, the kobolds quickly learned to obey orders. With the addition of more than 100 kobolds, the construction speed of the territory more than doubled. Even though the Houndhead men couldn't do detailed work, they could still do things like digging and logging. What surprised Su Len even more was that even though they had to work hard every day, very few kobolds wanted to escape. These small tribes in the wilderness were often in a state of starvation. Now that they could fill their stomachs, even if they had heavy work to do every day, these kobolds were not willing to leave. Later on, there were even a few overseers among the kobolds who helped Su Len and the others exploit the kobolds. Moreover, these kobold supervisors were even more outstanding than the barbarians. They were much more ruthless than the barbarians when it came to exploiting their own kind. As a result, the kobold supervisors' work had increased. Over the next few days, Su Len led 35 barbarians and swept through all the tribes within a 20-kilometer radius of the camp. In total, they destroyed 1 Jackalan tribe, 2 goblin tribes, and 1 kobold tribe. This time, they obtained more than 300 goblins and 100 kobolds. As for the Jackalans, Su Len ordered them to be killed. Other than the barbarians in the camp who could suppress the Jackalans, the mercenaries couldn't. Once Su Len led the barbarians to patrol the territory, who knew if the Jackalans would rebel? Moreover, there were more goblins and kobolds in the camp. Su Len didn't think that these guys would be obedient. Moreover, the Jackalans ate 4 to 5 times more than the kobolds, but they only did 2 to 3 times more work. Therefore, killing them directly was the best choice. With the goblin and kobold slaves, the construction of the territory sped up. The first thing to be completed was the wall of the territory. In order to protect the territory, the construction of the wall was prioritized. Because of the lack of manpower and the short time, the wall wasn't made of brick, which was commonly seen in the Kingdom of Florence. Instead, it was made of mud and wood. Wooden stakes were driven into the foundation. Then mud and reeds were used to build the wall. The entire territory's wall was close to a square, and the length of the 4 sides added together was close to 2 kilometers. A wall of this scale could be considered a medium-sized town in the Kingdom of Florence. For a newly developed camp, it was already quite big. Just after the construction of the territory's wall was completed, Su Len heard a cold and emotionless electronic sound. Ding! The construction of the territory's wall is completed. Your territory has completed a basic construction, and the territory interface is officially opened. Territory, unnamed, area. 20 kilometers with the camp as the center. City, none, crude camp. Popular sentiment, 60 tax, 0 income, loss. Population, 45 slaves, 35 barbarians, 337 goblin slaves, 352 kobold slaves, 40 mercenaries. Supplies, 34 wheeled carriages, 200 units of food, 20 units of bacon. 1 unit of food is equivalent to 100 kilograms. Barbarians need 2 kilograms of food and 1 kilogram of fish per day. Mercenaries need 1 kilogram of food and half a kilogram of fish per day. Slaves need 1 kilogram of food and 2 meals per day. Kobolds and goblins need 1 kilogram of food and some fish soup per day. Currently, the food stored can last for 4 months. Existing buildings, wall, basic. Wall. Basic wall made of a mixture of logs, mud, and reeds. It has a certain protective function. Although it looks broken and seems unreliable, it can resist ordinary attacks in the wilderness. Wall defense plus 20. Durability plus 50. Stability plus 10. With a wall, the territory has more security. Su Len looked at the data about the territory in his mind and rubbed his face hard. This kind of poor territory, any knight's territory in the south was better than his. The whole territory not only had no income, but it also had to charge money. In addition to these attributes, there was also a directory of constructible buildings in the system. Lord's Castle. The Lord's Castle is the residence and official residence of the Lord, and it has defensive ability. It is the administrative center of the territory, and its existence represents the sovereignty and stability of this area. Administration plus 50, stability plus 20, rule plus 40, prestige plus 50. The Lord's Castle can train administrative personnel for the territory. Barracks. The barracks have good training facilities, and can continuously train qualified troops for the territory. Also living in the barracks can let the troops in a training state. Comfort minus 20, iron blood plus 20, training plus 20, stability plus 30, morale plus 20. Residential houses. The residential houses of the territory's residents, and can provide shelter from the wind and rain, increasing the sense of belonging. Stability plus 30, popular sentiment plus 20, prosperity plus 10, population growth plus 10. Chapter 15. Arable land. The arable land within the walls can continue to produce food when the territory is besieged, helping the territory survive the crisis. The food produced from the arable land can be used to feed the residents and increase the population. A strong agriculture is the foundation of a country. Harvest plus 20, stability plus 20, prosperity plus 10. Trading market. This is the main commercial area in the territory. It can bring in a lot of money and is one of the main sources of the territory's funds. Trade plus 30, prosperity plus 30, taxes plus 30, security minus 10. Roads. If you want to be rich, you have to build roads first. A good road will bring a lot of convenience to your territory. Movement speed plus 10, prosperity plus 15, stability plus 15. Security. Maintain the security of the city and fight crime. When the territory's population increases, all kinds of crime will naturally appear. You need a security team and a security officer to manage it. Security plus 20, popular sentiment plus 20, crime minus 5, intimidation plus 15. Beacon tower. Building a beacon tower can quickly transmit information within the territory and warn the territory in advance. Communication plus 30, stability plus 20. Lumber mill. The lumber mill can provide a lot of wood for the territory and is very important for the development of the territory. At the same time, it can provide a source of funds for the territory. Work efficiency plus 20. Prosperity plus 5. Port. The territory has 2 rivers. These rivers provide the territory with a strong transportation capacity and abundant fishing. The cost of using ships to transport goods is very low. At the same time, it can be used for military purposes. Relying on ships, the army can quickly disembark from the 2 rivers. Shipping plus 20, fishing plus 25, prosperity plus 15. Well, the well can provide the territory with a clean water source. At the same time, when the city is besieged, the city will not lack water. Hygiene plus 15, security plus 15. Although the territory did not lack food, there was a saying that people without foresight would have immediate worries. Therefore, Su Len set aside some land within the walls to cultivate. At the same time, he also sent some people to build the port and fishing boats in order to obtain more fish. As everyone knew, if the human body did not consume fat, meat, and high-protein food, then the daily consumption of grain would be several times higher. Now that there were abundant fish, the consumption of food would be greatly reduced. At the same time, the salted fish made from fish could be stored for a long time. Su Len had already investigated the Red Sand River and the White Water River. These 2 rivers were wide and the water flow was stable. The water plants on both sides were dense and there were many reeds. The surrounding beasts often came here to drink water. In the reeds on the banks, there were many water birds. Sulen also sent some people to the reeds to get the eggs. These birds would build nests and incubate chicks in the reed marshes. Each nest would contain several eggs. According to Sulen's request, each time he touched the eggs in the reed marshes, he could only take half of the eggs at most, and he could not touch the nest repeatedly. In this way, he could obtain a lot of eggs without reducing the number of waterfowl. From then on, egg drop soup was added to the daily meals in the camp. To be honest, the food prepared in Sulen was much better than the free people in Cult City. After all, it was impossible for free people to have fish and eggs for every meal. The Red Sand River and the White Water River meandered to the southeast. Sulen guessed that the two rivers would either flow into the ocean or a large lake. If these two rivers eventually converged into the ocean, he might be able to use this waterway to go out to sea and do business with the outer islands and other countries. However, this would have to wait until his territory was developed. After setting aside a portion to build the port and farmland, the rest of the slaves began to build Sulen's castle. As the center of the territory, the lord's castle had to be completed as soon as possible. After Sulen gave the blueprint to a few slave craftsmen, they directed the other slaves to continue building the territory. In fact, Sulen's territory already had a plan. This plan was made by the system. The west and north of the territory were the Red Sand River and the White Water River. The port was built there, and the market was also going to be built there. Due to the convenience of transportation, Sulen planned to turn this place into a business district. The east of the territory was the military camp, and the lord's castle was located on the central axis of the city, facing south. The entire territory was symmetrical. After that, Suluan continued to lead the barbarians to patrol his territory. After this period of fighting, Suluan finally leveled up. In addition to him leveling up, 5 barbarians also successfully leveled up from level 2 to level 3 barbarian warriors. Sulen had reached level 13 after leveling up. Name, Sulen race, human level, 13, 328130000, strength, 26 dexterity, 28 spirit, 19 vitality, 25 charm, 18. In addition to the 2 attribute points from before, he now had 4 undistributed attribute points, a silver chest, and 3 attribute points. After opening the silver chest, Sulen obtained a skill book called Stonewall Formation from the chest. After the system integrated the rules of this world, this skill had also undergone some changes. It had a new name, Mud to Stone. After using this skill, one could quickly create several stone walls. This spell was very useful whether it was used to create a formation on the battlefield or to build a territory. Sulen thought for a moment and learned this skill. Mud to Stone required 2 skill points to learn. After learning it, he discovered that this skill could be used in 2 ways. One was mud to stone, and the other was the opposite, stone to mud. Next, Sulen tested it again. As a yellow light entered his feet, the soil under his feet suddenly arched up. In the blink of an eye, it turned into a wall, and the wall turned into stone in a breath. Sulen walked to the stone wall and gently knocked on it a few times with his hand. It was indeed a stone wall. The stone wall in front of him was 10 meters long, 3 meters high, and 50 centimeters thick. The defense of the stone wall was higher than that of ordinary stone. Sulen felt his magic. He could continuously create 6 stone walls of this size, and then his magic would be exhausted. He now had 190 points of magic. 1 point of spirit was equivalent to 10 points of magic. Creating a stone wall would consume 30 points. Similarly, turning a stone wall into mud would consume 30 points of magic. Compared to the magic consumption, this spell was very useful. Sulen still had 4 free attribute points. This time, he added all of them to his spirit. His spirit became 23 points, and 230 points of magic could create 7 stone walls. The heal that he learned previously only consumed 10 points of magic each time. Now that he was in his best condition, he could continuously use the heal 23 times. Chapter 16. He had tested the effects of life heal before. It could quickly heal injuries on himself or others. However, it could only heal minor injuries such as broken bones. It was much less effective. Of course, it was still much faster than natural recovery. In the next few days, Sulen would take some time to cast mud to stone on the walls of his territory. The mud walls were turned into stone walls. Every morning, after using up all his mana, Sulen would bring his men to patrol the camp. When his mana was almost recovered, he would come back and cast mud to stone again. In just a few days, one of the walls had been turned into a stone wall. In addition to clearing out the goblins, kobolds, and gnolls in his territory, Sulen used a parchment to draw the rough terrain of his territory. What surprised him was that after he finished drawing the map, the system also activated the strategic map. The strategic map of the system was worlds apart from the one he drew. His map could only show the rough terrain of the area, but the strategic map of the system was amazing. It was completely scaled down to a certain scale. What surprised Sulen even more was that the strategic map could be zoomed in or out. However, this strategic map only showed the part of Sulen's territory. The areas beyond the territory were all black and could not be seen. At his location, there was an obvious mark of a small person on the map. Around the small person, there were dots that represented other people. This range was about 100 meters. After this range, it was no longer displayed. Sulen studied it for a while. The green dots represented his companions and subordinates. All the barbarians were of the same color. The mercenaries were yellow. As for the slaves, they were blue. In the battle map, people or monsters that were hostile to him were marked with red dots. Having the strategic map was a great help to him. It allowed him to have a god's perspective. The battlefield was one-sided and transparent to him. Not only could he command the army better, but he could also be the first to know if the enemy was plotting something. In addition to these, the map had detailed markings on the hills, rivers, forests, and plains within the territory. Although it was only some basic information, it wasn't easy to obtain such detailed information even in the 21st century, let alone in a world with a civilization level that was only in the middle world. Sulen tried to shrink the map. Soon, the area that represented his territory on the map shrank to a barely visible spot. Obviously, the size of this world was unexpectedly large. When he returned to the camp, it was still bustling with activity. 50 mu of farmland in the camp had been cultivated, and 200 mu of farmland outside the camp had been cultivated. In order to increase grain production, potatoes were planted in these farmlands. Compared to wheat, the yield of potatoes was several times higher. Although there was a lack of fertilizer in this world and the variety of potatoes was not as good as in his previous world, the yield of potatoes here was still more than 500 kilograms. As for wheat, the yield in the south could reach 400 kilograms, while in the north it was only 300 kilograms. More importantly, even in the cold climate of the north, potatoes could be easily cooked twice a year. In this way, 1 mu of potatoes could produce 6 to 8 times more food than wheat. As long as Sulen had a brain, he would know what to do. Only when he had a firm foothold here would Sulen slowly change part of the potato farmlands to wheat. After all, white bread made from wheat flour tasted good. Similarly, the port in the northwest of the territory was almost completed. Because there were no ships docking at the moment, the port wasn't built too big. So far, the port was used for fishing. There was no lack of trees in the wasteland. After the kobolds and gnomes cut down the trees, there were naturally craftsmen who went to build fishing boats. Although the trees that hadn't been dried were not good materials for making boats, they couldn't care less. The fishing boats that were made directly from logs had a short lifespan. It was estimated that they would be damaged or deformed in 3 months. However, there was no problem for them to be used for fishing. Because of the abundance of fish in the river, although there were only 5 or 6 fishing boats, they could catch 200 to 300 kilograms of fish every day. It could be said that just the fish here were enough to supply the camp's food. The excess fish had been pickled with salt, and while the sun was still scorching, these salted fish were dried and stored. In order to store food, Sulen built a large enough warehouse in the camp. The supplies brought by the 30 carriages and the things collected during this period were all stored in the warehouse. This warehouse was the most important thing in the camp. Even Sulen's lord's castle wasn't completed yet, but this warehouse was already built. In order to protect these supplies, Sulen assigned 5 barbarians to guard the warehouse day and night. Other people, including the hired mercenaries, were not allowed to come within 30 meters of the warehouse. The lord's castle was also under construction, but it was still far from completion. He didn't want to make do with his own residence, so the foundation of the lord's castle was still being laid. He planned to build the lord's castle entirely out of stone. He would first use mud to tamp it down, Then use mud to rock to turn the mud into stone. In addition to these, the roads in the territory were also being built. Su Len had too many complaints about the roads in this world. Even in prosperous cities like Kulin City and Cult City, all the roads were muddy except for the main roads. Many places were filled with dirty water. All kinds of excrement, dead rats, household garbage, and unknown objects with strange smells were thrown on the road. The whole city was like a giant toilet. Once it rained, the city would be like an ocean. If one went out at this time, it would feel like they were walking in a cesspool. Su Len would never allow his territory to be like this. So when he was building his territory, he had already prepared to harden the roads or lay a layer of stones. At the same time, he had also prepared drainage facilities in the city. When his territory was officially established, he would also legislate. He would make strict sanitary regulations, forbidding dumping and defecation. All garbage and excrement had to be dumped in designated places and transported out of the city. He would build a fertilizer factory outside the city and ferment the garbage and excrement to make fertilizer. Chapter 17. Although Su Len had lived in this world for more than 10 years, he was still not used to the city environment. Apart from the nobles' district and the merchants' district, the sanitation in the other areas was too poor. Now that he was developing his own territory, Su Len naturally wouldn't let his city become like that. Boss, look, the signal. Just as Su Len was checking the progress of the construction of the territory, a barbarian warrior pointed to the northeast and shouted. Su Len looked up and saw a cloud of black smoke in the distance. Sullen's eyes flashed as he leaped onto the city wall. After setting up the camp, Su Len had already built a few beacon towers around the territory. These towers were simple in structure. They were made of mud and then turned into stone using mud to rock. There were some things to ignite the fire inside. He had also arranged for people to stand guard on the towers. If they discovered an enemy invasion, they would light the beacon immediately to alert the territory and send a signal. One beacon meant that there were about 100 enemies. 2 beacons meant that there were more than 500 enemies. If there were 3 beacons, it meant that there were more than 1,000 enemies. Su Len stood on the walls of the camp. 2 beacons were clearly visible in the distance. It was obvious that there were at least 500 enemies this time. Seeing this situation, Su Luen didn't delay and immediately ordered all the kobolds and goblins to be locked up in the fence in the camp. He didn't trust these slaves at all. What if these goblins and kobolds rebelled while he was leading people to fight the enemy? As for killing them, what would happen to the construction of the territory? Therefore, he could only lock them up temporarily. Immediately tell everyone to return to the team. Also, tell the mercenaries to help defend. Su Len ordered directly. Yes, boss. The barbarian warrior beside him immediately ran to pass on the order. After the order was given, the camp immediately became busy. The kobolds and goblins were locked up in the fence, and the 35 barbarian warriors quickly gathered. After this period of battle, half of these barbarian warriors had become barbarian warriors. The leader, Johnson, had even advanced to become a giant axe berserker. This team of barbarian soldiers was much stronger than when they first entered the wilderness. Just as the barbarians finished gathering, the mercenaries also hurried over. Master Su Len, I think we should abandon this place and leave as soon as possible. As soon as he walked over, Xion, the leader of the mercenaries, said impatiently, Those gnolls, goblins, and kobolds are still far away from us. If we leave now, we have a great chance of escaping. Su Len looked at Jean coldly until his voice became softer and softer. Finally, he stopped. Are you done? Su Len said coldly as he looked at the embarrassed Xion. If you are, then listen to me. This time, there will be no less than 500 enemies, but the highest number will not exceed 1,000. This is a crisis, but also an opportunity. As long as we can defeat this batch of enemies, then we will have a long period of development in the future. Similarly, if you perform well in this battle, I will give him 20 mu of farmland after the construction of the territory is completed. If he makes enough contributions, I will bestow him the title of a knight. In order to deal with this crisis, Su Len offered enough benefits. It was not easy to become a noble. Now, there was a shortcut in front of them. Hearing Sullen's promise, the low morale of the mercenaries instantly soared. They all rubbed their hands together, and their eyes were filled with eagerness. Su Len was very satisfied with this situation. To be honest, it was not impossible for Su Len to deal with 500 to 600 gnolls. It was mainly because the area of the camp was too big. With only 36 of them, they could not even line up a wall. The gnolls could easily go around the wall and destroy the camp. In this case, even if he killed all the gnolls, it would be useless. Ta-ta-ta. Just as Su Len was mobilizing the mercenaries, a date red horse galloped in the direction of the camp. As it galloped, it shouted, "Military emergency!" The surrounding people all dodged and let it pass. Su Len, Monseigneur. This is not good. There are 700 enemies this time. In addition to the gnolls and kobolds, there are also a dozen trolls. The mercenary knight ran to Su Len and agilely jumped off the horse. "Thank you for your hard work. Go and rest." Su Len smiled at him and said, "Take out the white bread and bacon. I remember there is some ale in the warehouse. Take it out this time as well," Su Len said to the barbarian warrior behind him. At this time, to boost morale, Su Len had prepared a sumptuous meal. "Yes, boss. I will take someone to take it out," the barbarian warrior behind him said respectfully. "Also, take out the bacon and sausages. The fish must also be served today," Su Len ordered directly. In this world, apart from the nobles and merchants, everyone else basically had 2 meals a day. This time, because of the upcoming war, lunch was specially added. "I want to see all the warriors and mercenaries eat meat this afternoon." "Yes, Monseigneur. I will prepare it immediately." The chef was sweating profusely and said nervously. The fish were cut open one by one. In the empty space in the middle of the camp, a dozen large pots were boiling hot water. The slaughtered fish were cut into pieces and then placed directly into the pot to cook. Pieces of bacon and sausages were thrown into the pots after being cut. Although the chef's skills were not very good, the enticing aroma still made people swallow their saliva uncontrollably. The people did not have to wait for too long. The food was finally ready. Su Len picked up a bowl and filled it with delicious meat soup. He then took a piece of white bread and took a bite. Seeing that Su Len was the first to eat, the mercenaries and barbarians swarmed forward and took their share. The meat soup was delicious. There were mushrooms, bacon, and ham in it. Su Len found a rock and squatted on it to drink the soup. The barbarian warrior was also very quiet. He sat on the ground with a bowl of meat soup and a piece of white bread in one hand. According to the previous reports, there were more than 700 enemies this time. Half of them were goblins and kobolds, about 300 to 400 of them. The rest were gnolls and a dozen trolls. Trolls were a powerful creature. They were far more powerful than gnolls. They were very strong and liked to use maces. However, their strongest point was their terrifying regenerative ability. Broken limbs could be regrown. Only magic, fire, or strong acid could truly kill them. P.S. There were some problems with the contract, so it was remailed. It will probably be fixed on Monday. Chapter 18. In Sullen's camp, there were only 35 barbarians and 40 mercenaries who could fight. As for the slave craftsmen, their fighting power was negligible. Besides, Su Len was reluctant to let them fight on the battlefield. The cost of these slave craftsmen was much higher than the barbarians. Just these 45 slaves cost more than 1,000 kinner. If these slave craftsmen died on the battlefield, he would have no money to buy more. After a sumptuous lunch, Su Len asked the mercenaries to start organizing their equipment. Then he led the mercenaries to the wall in the northeast. Because of the lack of time, most of the wall in the camp had not been turned into stone. Part of it was on the east side. There were only 2 gates in Sullen's territory. One was on the east side, and the other was on the west side. This time, the enemy was coming from the northeast. There was a high chance that they would attack the east gate. Su Len was going to set up some traps here. The barbarians were experts in setting traps. When they hunted in the wilderness, they often relied on traps. Although these traps were not very effective against large numbers of monsters, they could still kill as many as they could. While the barbarians were making traps, Su Len, together with the remaining 45 slave craftsmen, moved out the dried reeds collected these days and piled them near the east gate. Time passed by. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The south was still hot, but the northern wilderness was already very cool. The autumn air was refreshing. In the distance, a black line was quickly approaching. When they got closer, they realized that it was not a black line. It was a huge army made up of thousands of goblins, gnolls, kobolds, and gnolls. In fact, rather than an army, they were more like a group of bandits. No, they were worse than bandits. Most of them did not even have clothes, and the weapons in their hands were mostly wooden sticks or bone weapons. Only the gnolls used crude metal weapons. Although many of the weapons looked inferior at first glance, they were still metal weapons. In addition to these monsters, Sulen also saw a few tall monsters. These monsters were even taller than the gnolls. Their bodies were muscular and looked very powerful. Sulen had seen pictures of monsters before. These monsters were trolls. Although the trolls were few in number, they were far stronger than the gnolls. Although there were only a dozen of them, they could easily defeat a group of 100 gnolls. The maces in the hands of these trolls were at least 40 to 50 kilograms in weight. They looked ugly, and there was still iron residue on them that hadn't melted, but their power hadn't decreased at all. The number of monsters in this group was also different from the information they received. There were at least 1,400 monsters in this group, which was double the number of monsters that Sullen's group had. This number was almost 20 times more than the number of monsters that Sullen's group had. The mercenaries standing on the city walls felt their hearts race, and their hands and feet turned cold. Looking at the monsters in the distance, their minds went blank, and their eyes were filled with fear. If it weren't for the fact that they knew they couldn't outrun monsters in the wilderness, these mercenaries would have dropped their weapons and fled long ago. Seeing this, Sulen shook his head inwardly. These mercenaries' mental fortitude was too weak. Master Sulen, there are more than 1,000 of these monsters, and we have less than 100 people. We can't defend against their attacks at all. This is no longer a matter of saving face for the nobles. I suggest we drive away the gnoll and kobold slaves, abandon all our supplies, and retreat immediately. Xion said anxiously. Retreat? Why should we retreat? With these chickens and dogs? Sulen slapped the city wall and laughed. I think they're too few. With so many slaves, as long as we capture half of them, I'll be able to build my lord's castle very quickly. Hearing Sullen's words, the mercenaries looked at each other. They looked at Sulen as if they were looking at an idiot. The barbarians, on the other hand, were cheering for Sulen. Although they had followed Sulen for less than a month, these barbarians were completely loyal to Sulen. They would carry out Sullen's orders without hesitation. Just as the mercenaries were struggling to escape, the army of monsters outside launched an attack. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Arrows were thrown from afar. Sulen swung his spear lightly and deflected all the arrows aimed at him. The barbarians also swung their weapons and deflected the arrows. Only a few unlucky mercenaries were hit, but the arrows were too weak. The arrowheads couldn't even penetrate their leather armor. The gnolls' archery skills were very poor. Their strength was limited and they couldn't use strong bows. Most of the arrowheads were made of bone. It was effective against unarmored monsters, but it was useless against Sulen and the others. Seeing that the arrows were ineffective, the gnolls roared angrily and waved their maces, sending a gnoll who couldn't dodge in time flying. They then roared at the army of monsters, and the entire army began to attack the city. A distance of 30 to 40 meters was covered in a few seconds. However, many of the monsters had just charged 10 meters when they either stepped into a pit, had their sawls pierced by wooden spikes, or were hit in the head by falling rocks. Some unlucky ones fell and were trampled to death by the monsters behind them. However, these didn't stop the army of monsters. Soon, the gate was breached. Sulen didn't send anyone to stop them. Instead, he led the barbarians and mercenaries to retreat to the camp. The monsters were very excited to break through the gate so easily. In their minds, human fortresses were difficult to break through, but as long as they broke through, there would be rich spoils of war. Sweet food, beautiful clothes, all kinds of beautiful objects, and tender human flesh. These hot-headed monsters didn't care how the camp was breached so easily. Regardless of whether they were gnolls, or gnolls, they all swarmed toward the gate. Behind the gate, the kobolds who rushed in first wanted to rush in and loot, but they were dumbfounded when they saw two stone walls on both sides of the gate. Before they could figure out what was going on, they were pushed forward by more monsters behind them. These two stone walls were created by Sullen's mud to stone skill. There were a total of 30 meters of stone walls on both sides of the east gate. With two stone walls blocking their way, the gnolls were able to move forward. It didn't take long for the monsters to see their enemies. Two teams of 30 barbarian warriors held their giant axes and waited. They didn't dodge, and they couldn't dodge. In a breath, these barbarian warriors came into contact with the army of monsters. They swung their giant axes, and blood and flesh flew everywhere. The monsters in the front line fell like wheat being harvested. Chapter 19. The battle had been intense since the beginning. Faced with the barbarians' sharp battle axes, goblins, kobolds, and even gnolls could not withstand more than 2 hits. The ground where the two sides were fighting was soon dyed red with blood. In the narrow space, the goblins and kobolds did not even have a chance to escape. They were directly cut in half by the axes. The first row of barbarian warriors was tired, and the second row immediately took their place. The barbarian warriors took turns killing the monsters, and their efficiency was not affected at all. The monsters in front were blocked by the barbarians and could not move an inch forward. Seeing their companions being killed so easily, many goblins, kobolds, and gnolls wanted to retreat. However, the monsters at the back did not know what was happening in front of them and continued to charge forward. In the end, hundreds of monsters had squeezed into the area 30 meters behind the east gate of the camp, and the number was still increasing. Su Len stood on the high platform at the back and looked at the monsters flooding in from the east gate of the camp. His expression did not change at all. After seeing that the space surrounded by the stone wall was filled with monsters, Su Len decisively ordered a retreat. The barbarians who had resisted at the exit for more than 10 minutes all retreated. Although it was only a short 10 minutes, they had used up as much energy as a battle. The continuous high-intensity battle had also tired them out. After the barbarians retreated, the monsters who were no longer under pressure were overjoyed and wanted to rush out quickly. However, as soon as the first batch of barbarians rushed out, a stone wall suddenly rose from the ground and blocked the passage in a breath. The gnolls and goblins who could not stop in time slammed into the stone wall. For a moment, dust flew everywhere. Some of the weaker monsters had their sternum crushed and blood spurted out of their mouths. Many gnolls wanted to climb over the stone wall, but the crowded space did not give them a chance to do so. Some lucky ones directly stepped on the bodies of the goblins and kobolds and climbed over the stone wall. However, as soon as they landed, they were stabbed by 5 or 6 mercenaries with spears. Seeing the army of monsters in the simple barbican, Sullen's face revealed a bloodthirsty smile. Under the afterglow of the setting sun, there was a hint of ferocity. Boom! The spear slammed into the ground. Set fire! A loud shout clearly spread throughout the battlefield. In the next second, dozens of torches suddenly rose around the barbican. Then, cans of burning kerosene were thrown into the barbican. Boom! The kerosene instantly ignited into a raging fire. Even the reed poles that had been piled up in the barbican were set ablaze. The monsters that had been tainted by the oil slapped their hands frantically, trying to put out the fire. However, other than igniting more places, there was no effect at all. All the monsters frantically tried to escape, but the surrounding monsters made it impossible for them to move. Even the previous city gate suddenly dropped a 1,000-pound gate. The entire barbican was completely sealed off in an instant. The flames in the barbican grew bigger and bigger. Many gnolls' fur was instantly ignited. The flames burned wantonly in this space, and the screams of the monsters could be heard everywhere. The monsters that were trapped in a desperate situation became even crazier. In order to survive, they began to attack the other monsters around them, trying to clear enough space so that they could step on the corpses of their companions to escape the barbican. However, the moment these monsters landed on the ground, they were killed by the barbarian warriors or mercenaries guarding the perimeter before they could even celebrate. The fire dyed the sky red, and the temperature of the entire camp rose by several degrees. The monsters in the barbican were even more uncomfortable. There was a burning smell in the air, mixed with the fragrance of meat. The stone walls were slightly red from the heat, and the flames showed no signs of weakening. Although the reeds and kerosene had been burned out, the oil from the animals became the new fuel. Countless gnolls and kobolds that were still alive kept wailing. These sounds were getting weaker and weaker. The flames had used up all the oxygen in the area. Many monsters that were not burned to death by the flames died of suffocation. The entire barbican had become a fiery hell. Monsters were burned to ashes in the flames. The scorching heat waves rolled. Even the mercenaries who were close to the barbican had their hair curled up. The scorching flames had burned their skin red. These mercenaries, who had been thinking of escaping before, were now all excited. They held their weapons and killed the monsters that escaped from the sea of fire. After Su Len started the fire, he no longer paid attention to the turtles in the barbican. In his eyes, The monsters in the barbican were already dead. Although there were a large number of gnolls, and kobolds in the barbican, there were still some outside the barbican. He did not plan to let these monsters go. After all, he was severely lacking in slaves. Su Len went around the west gate of the camp. When he arrived at the east gate, the monsters were smashing the gate. To prevent the monsters in the barbican from escaping, the 1,000-pound gate was specially thickened. Although it had been dented by the attacks of the two trolls, it still did not break. The flames in the barbican made the monsters feel that something was wrong. However, the monster army was in a mess. It was too late to retreat even if they wanted to. After seeing Su Len and 30 barbarian warriors rushing over, a tall and strong gnoll wearing rough iron armor, who looked like the leader, howled. Then, the chaotic monster army began to gather. Even the trolls that were attacking the gate turned around and rushed over. Looking at the regrouped monster army, Su Luen narrowed his eyes. To be honest, he was a little surprised by this monster army. This group of monsters didn't rush up like a swarm of bees like the ones he had encountered before. They were actually disciplined. Although this monster army's discipline was very poor, this was already a big improvement. At the front were the cannon fodder gnolls and gnolls, followed by a few trolls. There were also gnolls on the left and right. Although the formation was messy, it did not mean that it was ineffective. The gnolls in the front row formed a long spear formation. Although their weapons were sharpened bones and sharp stones, they were still lethal. Su Len buttoned up his beast-faced iron armor, then picked up a 3-meter-long spear and stretched his body. The barbarian warriors were on both sides of him. These barbarian warriors formed a conical formation, and Su Len was the arrowhead at the front. Charge! When the distance between the two sides was less than 100 meters, Su Len roared and rushed forward. The barbarians followed closely behind him. 100 meters was a distance that could be crossed in less than 10 seconds. Although Su Len and the others only had 30 or so people, when they charged, they had an unstoppable momentum. An invisible pressure enveloped the entire battlefield. Chapter 20. More than 30 barbarian warriors ran like lightning, the sharp axes in their hands shining with a cold light. If they were facing the elite soldiers of the Kingdom of Florence's Giant Bear Legion, these barbarians would have suffered heavy casualties even if they charged. However, they were facing these unarmored barbarians. How could mere flesh and blood stop them? 50 meters. Seeing Su Len and the barbarians getting closer, the kobold archers behind the phalanx shot their arrows. The arrows fell from the sky like raindrops. Su Len waved his spear and deflected the arrows. The barbarian warriors behind him used their giant axes to protect their vital parts and let the arrows fall on their bodies. Most of the arrows did not penetrate the leather armor, and some were even deflected. These arrows did not cause any trouble for Su Len and the others. In the blink of an eye, they were only 20 meters away. Next was the phalanx in front of them. Although these gnomes were not strong, if they rushed in recklessly, Su Len would be fine, but the barbarians would definitely suffer losses. Hand axes. Throw. In the next moment, 35 hand axes flew into the phalanx. How strong were the barbarians? The hand axes that were thrown out instantly broke the phalanx of the gnomes into pieces. Many gnomes were directly beheaded by the hand axes. The phalanx of the phalanx lost its formation and could not withstand a single blow. Su Len led the barbarians behind him and rushed into the phalanx of the gnomes. Like a gust of wind sweeping away fallen leaves, they swept the phalanx of the gnomes into a pile of trash. The kobolds behind the phalanx of the gnomes collapsed. A huge gap appeared in the formation of the monster army. Su Len and the barbarians were like a shining steel knife that stabbed directly into the enemy's chest. The phalanx of the phalanx continued to advance without stopping. All the monsters in front of Su Len were completely crushed. After continuously penetrating the phalanx of the gnomes and the kobolds, they crashed into the gnolls. To be able to survive in the wilderness and become a medium-sized tribe, these jackalans were not weak. They were even more valiant than the ones Su Len had encountered before. After seeing Su Len and the others rushing over, the group of gnolls roared. Su Len swept the spear in his hand, and with his inhuman strength, the iron spear shaft tore through the air and instantly swept the gnolls in front of him away. After being swept by the spear shaft, the gnolls' bodies began to break. Their sternum and spine were shattered, and their internal organs were shattered into pieces by this strange force. Then, mixed with blood, they spurted out from their mouths and noses. Taking advantage of the gap that Su Len had opened, the remaining barbarians swung their axes and activated windmill. Whirlwind slashes with white sword energy cut the monsters in front of them into two halves. Flesh and blood splattered everywhere, and the gnolls were easily harvested like weeds. Seeing Su Len and the others rushing forward, the leader of the gnolls kept roaring, wanting to command the others to continue attacking. However, the group of monsters was already scared out of their wits. No matter how much he roared, they were unwilling to move forward. Fortunately, they still had a trump card in their team, which was 9 trolls that were more than 2.5 meters tall. Just as Su Len swept the last gnoll in front of him away, the front was empty. The entire army of monsters had been pierced through by him. The entire battlefield was in chaos. The middle of the army of monsters had completely collapsed, and the 2 wings were useless at this time. Roar! Just as Su Len was about to kill the leader of the gnolls, an angry roar came from the side. Then, a gust of wind approached quickly. A troll rushed over like a heavy truck. Su Len waved his arm and blocked the mace. The huge force bent the long spear made of fine iron. The mace was lifted high, and the troll that was rushing over retreated at an even faster speed. Then it fell heavily to the ground. Blood spurted out of its mouth. With such a serious injury, other monsters would have died long ago. However, for the trolls, as long as they were given time, they would recover in a short time. It was not that they had not encountered difficult opponents before, but in the end, they had relied on the strength of the trolls to win in the end. Unfortunately, they had calculated wrongly this time. Seeing Su Len send a troll flying, the remaining trolls were not afraid at all. They roared and rushed at him. Seeing the trolls rushing over, Su Len smiled coldly. He grabbed the shaft of the spear with one hand and the body of the spear with the other. Then, he bent the spear hard and straightened the somewhat deformed spear. Then, he waved it hard at the trolls. Dark ice cut. 3 streams of cold air gathered in front of him in an instant, then condensed into 3 ice blades, accompanied by a bone-piercing chill. The 3 ice blades flew out in an instant. The surrounding gnolls only felt their bodies become stiff. In the next second, a bone-piercing chill flashed by, and then they were plunged into endless darkness. The 3 ice blades cut through the trolls' bodies like rotten wood. Several of the charging trolls stopped in their tracks. In the next moment, their strong bodies were neatly cut into several pieces. No blood flowed out. All of the blood was frozen in an instant. Even the trolls' bodies were frozen at this moment. The 3 ice blades flew for more than 30 meters before disappearing into the air. All monsters in the path of the ice blades, whether gnolls, or trolls, were cut and frozen. The trolls that had the powerful ability to grow again were also dead. The mercenaries on the city wall watched everything that happened on the battlefield not far away. They only felt a chill in their hearts, and their bodies involuntarily broke out in a cold sweat. Although they had seen the Lord's invincible posture on the battlefield several times, the opponents this time were trolls. The powerful and unstoppable force that swept through the battlefield made them feel like the noble in front of them was a mythical hero. Legendary heroes are nothing more than this, Xion said with a pale voice. Just as the mercenaries were sighing, the battle came to an end. After seeing that their biggest reliance was killed, the entire monster army completely collapsed. No one dared to stop them. After seeing this situation, the gnoll leader turned around and ran without saying a word, but it was already too late. Su Len moved very quickly, and the enemies in front of him dodged. Those who dodged too slowly were directly torn apart by the power of Su Len's spear. The gnoll leader saw the distance between the two rapidly closing, and then madly accelerated to escape. Su Len shook the spear in his hand and then threw it forward with force. Chapter 21. The spear pierced through the air and pierced through the gnoll leader with a sharp whistling sound before nailing it to the ground. The gnoll leader's body twitched a few times before it slowly lowered its head. Dark red blood flowed down the spear to the ground. Seeing the gnoll leader nailed to death by the spear, the natives felt a chill run through their bodies, causing them to tremble uncontrollably. As the murderous god's eyes swept over them, they all lowered their heads. No one dared to look directly at him. That gaze gave them the feeling that it was several times colder than the cold wind of the northern ice plains. After the battle concluded, Su Luan did not have time to rest and led the barbarians to capture slaves. Because the monster army had come from afar, adding on the intense battle, the barbarians had used up all of their strength. Even if they wanted to run, they did not have the strength to do so. Soon, They had captured a large number of slaves. An epic victory. Under your command, you and your army won an epic victory. As the war ended, the monsters that were lucky enough to escape spread your deeds far and wide. Your name began to spread across the wastelands. Your prestige +1. The battle is over. You have received 15,432 experience points. Your level has increased. You have received 2 free attribute points and 2 skill points. You have received 2 silver treasure chests. In this battle, you have received Gem X5. Name, Sullen Race, Human Level, 14, 235, 814, 0000, Strength, 26 Agility, 28 Spirit, 23 Constitution, 25 Charm, 18. The other attributes did not change, but this time, there was an additional prestige, 1. The description was very simple. Your name has spread in a small area in the wilderness. In this battle, other than Su Len who leveled up, the other barbarians also leveled up. This time, none of the barbarians died. Only 3 of them were seriously injured. As for the light injuries, they were all slightly injured. This low casualty rate was because Su Len took the brunt of the danger. If it was not for Sullen's powerful strength, the barbarians would have suffered more casualties. Boss, a few of our brothers are seriously injured. I'm afraid they won't make it. Johnson came to Sullen's side and said sadly, the development of medicine in this world was very slow. Most of the time, they had to rely on the divine arts of the temple priests for treatment. Of course, they could also spend money to buy some holy water. There were no doctors in Sullen's territory, and no priests would follow the nobles to expand the territory. As for holy water, the cheapest holy water cost 10 kinner. With Sullen's stinginess, how could he buy it? However, although there was no sacrifice or holy water, Su Luen had the life-healing technique. Take me there, Su Len said directly. Soon, Su Len saw the 3 heavily injured barbarians. The wounds on their bodies were lacerations, which should have been caused by the Knoll warriors. These monsters were over 2 meters tall and were stronger than the Knoll barbarian soldiers. The barbarians only wore leather armor, and at most, their leather armor was embedded with some metal plates. These leather armor could deal with gnolls, kobolds, and gnolls, but it would be difficult to deal with the Knoll warriors. Against the Knoll warriors, these leather armor would not be of much use. The most seriously injured barbarian had a large gash on his chest, and 2 of his ribs were broken. Through the wound, one could see that his internal organs were squirming. With such serious injuries, his stomach was almost cut open. If the wound was a little deeper, he probably wouldn't have lasted until now. Su Len raised his hand, and a ball of light green light began to gather in his hand. In the next second, the light merged into the barbarian's body. The barbarian's wounds gradually stopped bleeding, and the hideous wound on his body began to close. However, the wound was only closed by a third before the green light disappeared. Obviously, life healing was not enough to save them. The green light dissipated, and the barbarian's HP continued to drop, but at a much slower rate than before. Seeing the light dissipate, Su Len used life healing on the barbarian again. Although the barbarian's wounds had not healed, his HP was no longer dropping. Life healing was only a beginner-level healing spell, and its effects were limited. The rest of the wounds would need to be healed by himself. Soon, Su Len pulled the 3 barbarian warriors back from the brink of death. Then, he applied gold balm on them, tied them with bandages, and had them carried back to the camp to recuperate. They would not be able to fight for at least a month. After the battle, the dozen or so barbarian warriors had all leveled up to become barbarian warriors. The most powerful one, Johnson, had broken through to become the ultimate barbarian soldier, the barbarian berserker. Several of his attributes had also leveled up. Beginner strength had leveled up to intermediate strength, and endurance had leveled up to intermediate endurance. Intermediate strength permanently increases strength by 4 points, stamina by 4 points. Intermediate endurance permanently increases HP by 25 points, stamina by 25 points, stamina recovery by 50%, and damage taken reduced by 15%. Apart from these 2 attributes, the attributes of Berserk had also changed. Berserk had become Advanced Berserk, reducing pain by 80%, increasing strength by 50%, increasing movement speed by 20%, Berserk duration by 50%, and reducing weakness by 30%. It could be said that Johnson's strength had increased by several times. If he was equipped with a set of armor, he would be a meat grinder on the battlefield. After the battle, Su Len obtained a large number of slaves. This time, the slaves included gnomes, kobolds, and gnolls, totaling up to 500. Among them, more than 200 had died in the battle, and those that died in the Barbican were not included. Su Len estimated that about 600 of them had died, and less than 100 had escaped. After this battle, the captives were all frightened and did not dare to resist. Su Len planned to keep them as slaves. Gnomes and gnomes were very similar, but the former was 1.5 meters tall, while the latter was only 1.2 meters tall. Gnomes were also one of the few races in the wasteland with good discipline. Although they were not very bright, they were more than enough to be slaves. Changsun, take these slaves back and lock them up alone. Su Len walked back, covered in blood. With every step he took, blood dripped from the gaps in his armor. Remember, don't let them escape. I still need these people to build me a castle. Don't worry, boss. I'll guard it myself. Johnson wiped off the bloodstains on his bald head and grinned at the slaves, revealing 2 rows of white teeth. Although he was smiling, the bloodstains on his face made people's hearts palpitate. Johnson would not let these monsters who had almost killed his brothers go so easily. Although he would not kill them, he would not let them off easily. Chapter 22. The fire in the Barbican burned until midnight before it gradually extinguished. The fire burned the surrounding walls and ground until it was hot. It was not until the next morning that Su Len dismantled the Barbican and began to clean up the corpses inside. After seeing the scene in the Barbican, although Su Len was already mentally prepared, he still felt the urge to vomit. The Barbican was filled with all kinds of charred corpses, and the air was filled with the smell of barbecue. This situation caused no one to eat meat in the camp for the next few days. He dug a big hole and buried all the corpses. Then he let the slaves clean the ground with water. Even so, there was still a faint smell of blood at the east gate of the camp. After dealing with the monster army, the camp ushered in a period of rapid development. This time, the native army they destroyed was the most powerful Gnoll tribe in the area. The destruction of this tribe made the other tribes in the area feel a lingering fear. The rules in the wilderness were very simple. The strong were the king. If Su Len wanted the ownership of this land, he had to defeat all the forces around the land. This way, he would be the ruler of this land. Now that the largest tribe around Sullen's territory had been destroyed, no one dared to provoke him for the time being. With more than 1,000 slaves, the construction of the camp sped up again. 3 days later, the construction of the port was finally completed. The port was built, and the fish provided every day increased. Next, some of the slaves continued to cultivate the farmland, while others built the blacksmith shop and the lord's castle. During this period of time, there were frequent battles. Many people's armor and weapons were seriously damaged and needed to be repaired before they could be used. However, there was no iron ore in the territory. If Su Len wanted to build a blacksmith shop in the territory, he had to solve the source of iron ore. Although the wilderness looked barren, there were still many resources, such as iron ore. Most of the gnolls who attacked Sullen's territory had metal weapons. These metal weapons looked rough, and many of them even had a lot of slag left, but they were still metal weapons. These crude weapons were better made by human blacksmith apprentices. In fact, these weapons were all produced by the Jackalan tribe. The Jackalans were also intelligent beings with high intelligence. They also knew how to smelt steel, but their level was too low. If they could make metal weapons, then where did the raw materials come from? Humans had long since sealed off the wastelands, and iron ore weapons were not allowed to be sold to these monsters. Therefore, the most reasonable explanation was that the Jackalans in this camp had discovered an iron mine. It just so happened that they knew some smelting techniques, but they themselves were half-baked. The weapons they made were naturally very crude. Because of the iron ore discovered by the Jackalans, Su Luen was not worried that there would be no raw materials after the blacksmith shop was built. As for occupying the iron mine now, he also wanted to occupy it, but he only had a little more than 100 people now. He was simply powerless to do so. Only when his camp had more people would he go and take the iron mine. In addition to iron ore, Su Len also needed to find a coal mine, which was the fuel for making iron. Temporary Lord's residence. How many supplies do we have now? Su Len sat on a recliner, squinting slightly as he asked his clerk. This clerk was chosen from the slaves. He could read and count. Although his standard was average, he had to make do until there was no better one. Monseigneur, we've used up a lot of supplies. You've also captured a lot of slaves recently. Our food consumption has doubled. We don't have much money left. We only have 300 kinner left. We've already paid the mercenaries their commission. We don't even have enough money left to buy supplies in Cult, the clerk said with a book in his hand. We need to build our territory and buy slaves to increase the population. 300 kinner is just a drop in the bucket, Sulen said as he rubbed his chin. The territory's development had reached a bottleneck. The reason was the population problem. Although there were thousands of slaves, if there was no one watching over them, they wouldn't work obediently. Once Sulen's manpower was spread out, he would be faced with the problem of not having enough manpower. Johnson, Sulen shouted. I'm here, boss. Johnson walked in from outside the door. Go back with some men and bring your wives and children here. It's safe here now, Sulen said with a smile. Really? I'll go arrange it right away. Johnson was indescribably excited when he heard that he could bring his wife and children back. Go and come back quickly. Sulen waved his hand impatiently. The barbarian's wife and children should be doing well. Although they were old and weak, the fighting strength of these women should not be underestimated. By the way, when you go back, spread the news that Sir Sulen has successfully built his territory in the wilderness. He needs all kinds of resources now, Sulen said after thinking for a while. He planned to lure the merchants to trade with him. As for the trade, he hadn't thought about it yet. Johnson left the camp with 2 giant axe warriors. Sulen didn't go out to capture any more slaves. In fact, the monster tribes around his territory had already noticed, and many of them had already left the area. After a few days of construction, the blacksmith shop was finally completed. The blacksmith shop is completed. Importing equipment data. Importing metal smelting technology. Metal casting technology. Import completion 10%, 20%, 50%. Import complete. The weapon and equipment section of the system store has been opened. Just as the blacksmith shop was completed, the cold voice of the system rang in his ears. Sulen was overjoyed. He quickly checked the rise of the Empire system in his mind. Blacksmith shop. The blacksmith shop can forge higher quality weapons for the warriors in the territory. The skills of the blacksmiths working in the blacksmith shop will be improved. The quality of the blacksmiths will also be improved. Blacksmith learning speed +2, production speed +1, quality of blacksmiths +1. In addition to the basic introduction, the gray shop button in the system interface lit up. When he opened the shop, a dazzling catalog of items appeared in front of him. There were bows, iron swords, spears, armors and so on. Not only were there normal items, but there were also many high-quality weapons. Of course, there were no divine weapons like the Firmament Emperor's Sword, Snake Spear, or Sky Halberd. However, when he thought about it, it made sense. If they weren't even sold in the game, it would be difficult to get them in the real world. Chapter 23. Other than weapons, the blacksmith shop also sold materials such as refined iron, steel, dark steel, and godly iron. However, the prices made Sulen's heart ache. The normal prices were reasonable, but for 100-year-old dark steel, the price soared to 100,000 kinner. As for the more expensive materials such as Millennium Dark Steel, Ninth Heaven Dark Steel, and Perilous Tungsten Steel, they were not for sale. In the game, these rare materials could not only be used to create the best godly equipment, but they also had magical effects. For example, 100-year-old dark steel had a self-healing effect. When worn, it would automatically restore health after a period of time, and it could also increase attributes. In the past, it was a must-have item in the game. After checking the catalog in the blacksmith shop, Sulen also found some equipment crafting blueprints. After using them, one could learn how to craft equipment. There were also blacksmithing experiences that could be used to improve a blacksmith's forging skills. However, the price was expensive. One book cost 1,500 kinner. After looking through the blacksmith shop, Sulen realized that he could not afford a single set of equipment. Of course, the blacksmith shop could not only buy weapons, but also let the blacksmith forge them. Although the blacksmith skills were not perfect, the price was much better. For example, The two-handed axes that Su Len bought for the barbarians cost 30 kinnar. If he let the blacksmith forge one himself, it would cost 15 kinnar at most. If he had his own iron ore in the future, the price could be lowered further. In fact, although Sulen's barbarian army was strong, they were not at their best. For example, the barbarian warriors were equipped with two-handed axes, chainmail, hand axes, or javelins. When the barbarian warriors came, they were even equipped with iron armor. Only then could they unleash their full strength. Now, all the barbarians were equipped with two-handed axes, leather armor, and hand axes. They were the lowest equipment. However, now that the blacksmith shop was built, Su Len planned to slowly equip them with equipment. Su Len built the blacksmith shop by the river. He planned to install some hydraulic machines in the blacksmith shop when the technology was ready. For example, the hydraulic forging machine was not too difficult to install. It could only be used in places with abundant water. Back in Kailan City, his father's blacksmith shop had already used this kind of machine. Now, he planned to use this technology here. With the hydraulic forging machine, the cost of producing equipment could be further reduced. After this period of fighting, Su Len and the others had seized thousands of metal weapons and armors. These weapons were generally of low quality, but they were still qualified as raw materials. Bruce was a blacksmith slave that he had bought, and blacksmiths were gunners here. One had to know that blacksmiths belonged to the middle-income class in the town. This guy had owed a lot of gambling debts. Not only did he lose his blacksmith shop, but he was also sold as a slave. Monseigneur, this blacksmith shop is not a problem at all. As long as I have the materials, I can make farming tools and equipment. Bruce rubbed his hands and said with a flattering smile. After being a slave for a period of time, he had enough. Su Len nodded and said, "That's good. Repair the soldiers' equipment and make farming tools and other tools. In the future, your supplies will be upgraded to a higher level." "Thank you, Monseigneur. I will work hard." After hearing Sulen's words, Bruce said happily. If his supplies were upgraded, he would be able to eat fish. In the future, he would not have to squeeze in a room with others and endure the stench of other people's feet and the sound of teeth grinding. Sulen's management of slaves was considered very benevolent in this era. He had set a set of standards for rewards and punishments and corresponding treatment for the slaves. He used these standards to give the slaves hope, or rather, to increase the slaves' enthusiasm for work. If the slaves were just muddling along, their work would be passable. If they did well, there would be no rewards, and if they did poorly, there would be punishments. In the end, these slaves' work efficiency would definitely not be high. However, Su Len gave out rewards and set a label for the rewards. This was like hanging a carrot in front of a donkey. If the donkey wanted to eat the carrot, it would naturally run forward. The lowest level of slaves was the coolie, and their treatment was also the standard of not starving to death. Corresponding to that were the kobolds and goblins. These coolies were the most common. As for the skilled slaves, they would be given better food and work goals. They would only be given food after they completed their work. If they did well, they would be given additional rewards. If they went further, their treatment would be upgraded again, such as meat and other food. If the slave made a meritorious service or made other contributions, it could be upgraded again. It could have better food and could have a separate residence. At the end of the rewards, Su Len also promised that if the slave reached the required contribution, he would give the slave the status of a free person and let him become a free person in the territory. Of course, this did not mean that Su Len would lose out. In fact, Sulen's contribution standard was 10 times the price of the slaves. In other words, if a slave wanted to get rid of his status as a slave, he would have to provide at least 10 times the value of the slave. Also, do you think it's over after you get rid of your status as a slave? After becoming a free person, he would still have to pay taxes, work for him, and develop his territory. No matter how you looked at it, he would not lose out. After Su Len announced this reward and punishment system, the efficiency of the slaves in the territory doubled on the same day. After the blacksmith shop was built, Su Len brought the spoils of war over. He was going to let the blacksmith smelt these scrap metals into iron ingots. Then he would use these iron ingots to repair the weapons of the barbarian warriors and make farming equipment and armor. Although the monsters in the wilderness were poor, Su Len had killed so many of them during this period of time that they would more or less have some metal weapons. After many little drops made in ocean, it was still a considerable amount. The biggest part was actually the spoils of war this time. Many of the gnolls and trolls that came to attack the territory this time used maces. Although these maces were crudely made and the metal smelting was not complete, they were still heavy. A single mace weighed at least 100 pounds. Even if there were many impurities in them, after smelting, they would still weigh 70 to 80 pounds. In the end, the number of iron ingots obtained was at least a few thousand pounds. Naturally, not many iron ingots were needed to repair weapons, so Sulen planned to use the remaining iron ingots to make armor for the barbarians. As for the iron of the worst quality, it would be used to make farming equipment. A few thousand pounds of iron ingots could be used to make almost 100 sets of armor. Although the barbarians were strong in attack, their defense was very weak. If these barbarians were all equipped with armor, their combat strength would at least increase by a level. Chapter 24. Bruce brought a few blacksmith apprentices to work. The slaves pushed a material cart and sent hundreds of pounds of scrap iron into the blast furnace. The blast furnace was hot, and the temperature of the entire blacksmith shop was at least 50 degrees. Bruce was bare-chested and only had a piece of cloth wrapped around his crotch. He directed the people to heat the blast furnace. Because there was no coal in Sulen, the blacksmith shop used charcoal for heating. The heat provided by charcoal was limited, only 700 degrees. Of course, this was in an open environment. If it was in a furnace, the temperature could reach 900 to 1000 degrees. The temperature needed for steel smelting was at least 1000 degrees. At this time, bellows were needed to help the combustion. Only in this way could the temperature reach the iron smelting temperature. Sulen didn't know much about iron smelting, but he remembered that after heating the air in advance and injecting it into the furnace, the temperature of the furnace could be increased by about 200 degrees. In this way, the temperature of the furnace could reach 1200 degrees, which was not much lower than using coal. In fact, although there were many advantages to using coal to smelt iron, such as fast smelting speed, high output, low cost, etc., there was a serious drawback. That was the sulfur content of coal. Most of the coal had a high sulfur content. If it was used to smelt iron, the iron would also contain sulfur, which would lead to a serious consequence. The iron would become brittle. The quality of the iron would decrease, and the weapons forged could not be compared with the weapons without sulfur. When the weapons were cut, they would even break directly. This situation could not be compensated for by the low cost. After all, no matter how low the cost was, if the things bought could not be used, then the money spent would be worthless. As for steel making, Sulen also knew a little about it. The difference between steel and iron was the amount of carbon. If the carbon content was high, it would be iron. If the carbon content was low, it would be wrought iron. However, Sulen really didn't know the specific ratio. If I knew that I would travel, I would have memorized all these knowledge points. Sulen rubbed his head and complained. Although he didn't know the exact amount of carbon in steel and iron, as an experienced blacksmith, Bruce still had some experience. Under the leadership of Bruce, several blacksmith apprentices set up the first-class anvils and heated up the iron ingots that had already been smelted into iron ingots before hammering them. This method of repeatedly hammering and heating iron ingot was to forge steel. After the iron ingot was repeatedly tempered, it was called refining. After this operation was repeated for 100 times, it was called refining steel. It was also the best steel on the market at present. Weapons forged with this steel were the best of the best. In the Kingdom of Florence, most of the weapons and armors used by the army were usually refined 30 times. Of course, there were also weapons that were better than this kind of well-tempered steel. Of course, although the technology of the dwarves was higher than that of the humans, in fact, it was also very difficult for the dwarves to forge well-tempered steel. It was just that they had other secret techniques. After seeing that the blacksmith shop was producing normally, Sulen began to look for ways to make money. The territory had been investing in but not producing, which was also very stressful for Sulen. When Johnson left, Sulen gave him 100 kinner. Now, he only had 200 kinner left. There were still some things in the storage space. 2 pieces of fine iron, some gems, and 2 silver treasure chests. The gems were the rewards from defeating the natives last time. Sulen checked them. Most of the gems were of average quality. Only 2 of them were of good quality. If he sold them to a gem merchant, he could sell them for 300 to 400 gold coins at most. This amount of gold coins would probably be spent in a month. It would probably take at least 2 years for the territory to be self-sufficient and have income. At the thought of this, Su Len wanted to rob the giant dragon's treasure. Legend had it that giant dragons were very rich. Of course, he could only think about it. Not to mention that giant dragons were very rare now. Just the power of the giant dragon itself would require at least the legendary level to fight against it. Right, there are still 2 treasure chests that haven't been opened. After saying that, Su Len chose to open the treasure chests. With a flash of light, the treasure chests disappeared, and the sound of a system notification rang in his ears. Congratulations, host. You have obtained a mechanical control book. Congratulations, host. You have obtained a bottle of Big Dipper Heavenly Elixir. Mechanical control? What's this? Su Len picked up the book and flipped through it. The book recorded the creation, principles, and uses of various machines. After reading the system's introduction, Su Len understood that this was a new skill that the system had created after integrating with this world. In the original game, this skill was mechanical control. It could summon mechanical soldiers such as wooden oxen. However, after coming to this world, it had become mechanical control. Moreover, even if he learned it, he wouldn't be able to create wooden oxen. He still needed to improve it. This time, the system didn't cheat him too much. It gave him an upgrade route. First, he needed to upgrade mechanical control to advanced. Then, he needed to learn the mechanical control secret technique. After learning the mechanical control secret technique, he still needed to find an NPC. After the Peach Blossom Immortal passed the NPC's test, he would receive a reward. This reward was awesome. It was actually the creation of puppet magic statues. This system actually gave him the creation of magic statues. It directly turned some of the Iron Men in the game into steel magic statues. Su Len had never seen a steel magic statue before. However, he still knew of its reputation. A steel magic statue had no problem sweeping through a group of knights. Take note that it wasn't a group of knights, but a group of knights. Let's not talk about the puppet magic statues for now. Who knows where to find the Peach Blossom Immortal? In the game, the Peach Blossom Immortal could be found as long as he went to the Peach Forest. Where could he find him in real life? This broken system didn't even give him a hint. Although he couldn't create mechanical puppets, mechanical control was still useful. For example, he could create some simple mechanical tools to speed up the construction of his territory. He could also create a hydraulic forging machine and a hydraulic blower for the blacksmith shop. With the hydraulic forging machine, the speed of forging tempered steel would increase by at least 10 times. After all, how could a human hammer compare to a machine? Moreover, the machine hammered at a uniform speed and had sufficient strength. Originally, he wanted to find some blacksmiths to research it. Now that he had this mechanical control manual, he could definitely create one himself. After learning mechanical control, Su Len picked up a glass bottle beside him. The bottle was filled with a blue translucent liquid. As the bottle shook, the liquid inside flashed with specks of starlight. It looked very beautiful. This item was also very rare in the game. Its effect was very simple. It increased one's attributes. Big Dipper Heavenly Liquid. A mysterious liquid formed by the convergence of the power of the stars. After use, it can increase one's strength or vitality. After use, it can increase one's strength or vitality by 3. Only one effect can be triggered at a time. Can be used repeatedly. Chapter 25. Su Len would never complain about having too many items that could increase his attributes. It was best to have more of them. Su Len picked up the Big Dipper Heavenly Serum and drank it. A cool energy spread through his body and quickly merged with it. Congratulations, host. Your constitution has increased by 3 points. He opened the system to check. On his personal panel, his original 25 constitution had become 28. Su Len stretched his body and adapted to the sudden increase in his constitution. He then prepared to make the hydraulic forging machine. It was not difficult to make a hydraulic forging machine because there were 2 rivers here. Both rivers had plenty of water. It was not a problem to build a hydraulic forging machine. Su Len drew all the parts of the hydraulic forging machine and asked his craftsman to make them according to the drawings. To put it bluntly, the hydraulic forging machine was powered by the water flow. Then, a steering device was used to convert the power from the water flow into the hammering force of the forging hammer. The most important part was actually the conversion device. However, it was very simple. Install a concentric axle on the water flow. The short wooden bar on the axle would move the forging hammer, causing it to rise and fall. This was the simplest hydraulic forging hammer. Sulen made some improvements to it. He used gears to change the rotation speed of the hammer so that the hydraulic forging machine could adjust the rotation speed and hammering force. The craftsmen in Sulen's territory were not bad. Moreover, the hydraulic forging machine's structure was not complicated. Therefore, with his guidance, a hydraulic forging machine was completed in 2 days. Let's begin. Sulen took a deep breath and looked nervously at the freshly made hydraulic forging hammer in front of him. "Open the gate," one of the craftsmen shouted. As his voice fell, the sluice gate opened, and the surging river water rushed in. The surging river water rushed into the channel that had been excavated, and quickly rushed to the water wheel. The heavy water wheel was driven by the current, and then slowly turned. As the water flow turned, the forging hammer connected to the water flow began to rise slowly. Soon, the heavy forging hammer was raised to a high enough position and then smashed down with a loud bang. Bang! The sound of metal was deafening and sparks flew everywhere. Then, the forging hammer was raised again and smashed down with a loud bang. Bang, bang, bang! The dull sounds of metal colliding rang out continuously, and soon became one. A piece of iron ingot was being hammered by the forging hammer in the water. The shape of the iron ingot could be seen with the naked eye becoming compact. It didn't take long for this iron ingot to be forged into a steel ingot. Sulen picked up the steel ingot sent by Bruce and weighed it with his hand. It was full of weight and toughness. Although it was not as good as the steel he got from the system, it was not much worse. Ding! The construction of the hydraulic forging machine was successful. The hydraulic forging machine will be integrated into the blacksmith shop. Hydraulic forging machine. This is a cleverly designed machine. The machine structure isn't too complicated, and it successfully uses the power of water to forge weapons and equipment. Production efficiency +3, steel quality +1. Sulen was also very excited when he saw that the system had recognized the hydraulic forging machine. With this hydraulic forging machine, the blacksmith shop's production speed had increased by 3 times. Good job! We can use this steel ingot to produce 35 sets of 2-handed axes and armors, Sulen said with satisfaction. How long will it take to complete the forging? Monseigneur, other than me, the blacksmiths are all apprentices. Their skills are still lacking, so the speed of forging armors. Bruce said hesitantly. I'll give you half a month. With the hydraulic forging hammer, the difficulty of forging weapons and equipment has been lowered. If you still can't do it, don't worry, Monseigneur, I promise to complete the task. Sulen's words made Bruce's heart skip a beat. He did not want to bargain anymore and immediately agreed. All right, I'll give you the blueprint later. Just forge the equipment according to the blueprint. Sulen waved his hand and gestured for Bruce to leave. He then opened the system interface and drew the equipment of the barbarian giant axe warriors. Now that he had the conditions, he was ready to equip the barbarians with the recommended equipment. After Sulen drew the blueprint, he asked someone to send it to Bruce. After the first hydraulic forging machine was built, the hydraulic blower was also put on the agenda. With the experience of the hydraulic forging machine, the speed of the blower was faster. It only took 1 day for the blower to be completed. Since it used hydraulic power, the blower was much bigger than the previous human-powered blower. It was 2 meters tall and 3 meters wide. This blower required at least 10 slaves to work together to operate. However, with the help of the water wheel, the blower was easily operated. Huff! Huff! Back and forth, a large amount of heated air was sent into the red-hot blast furnace. The temperature of the boiler, which was already very high, rose again. The heat waves were rolling. A few slaves who were close to the blast furnace were covered in red sweat. However, the sweat was quickly evaporated by the surrounding high temperature. A large amount of crude weapons and some scrap iron were sent into the blast furnace. They were quickly heated up, turned red, and finally became soft and liquefied. Hydraulic blower. A blower that uses hydraulic power to operate. Simple structure, ingenious design, can increase the temperature of the furnace. Work efficiency +2. Flame temperature +2. With the hydraulic blower, the temperature in the blast furnace was increased again. The higher temperature accelerated the melting speed of pig iron and ore, and the speed of iron making increased instantly. With the addition of the hydraulic blower and the hydraulic forging machine, the output of Sulen's blacksmith shop continued to increase. Although there was only one blacksmith shop, it was more than enough to supply the territory. Forging, quenching, grinding. In the blacksmith shop, Bruce and a few blacksmith apprentices were methodically forging weapons and armor. A two-handed axe with a steel blade that was specially made for barbarians was quickly formed. Su Len picked up a completed two-handed axe. This axe was made according to Sullen's blueprint. The two-handed axe purchased by the Kingdom of Florence was made according to the size of an ordinary person. The two-handed axe had a short handle and was much lighter. Compared with the axe in Sullen's hand, it was a whole size smaller. In fact, the barbarians were not very comfortable using it, and the weight of the axe was a little light. The average height of these barbarians was 2.1 meters, which was at least 30 centimeters higher than the Florentines. The weapons made according to the size of the Florentines were not suitable for them. Now the two-handed axe was made according to the size of the barbarians. It was very suitable for them to use. These two-handed axes weighed up to 15 kilograms. Only the barbarians could use them freely. Chapter 26. Because of the use of well-tempered steel, the two-handed axe was sharper and tougher than ordinary axes. Su Len deliberately let a barbarian warrior experiment with the two-handed axe. As a result, the thick pine tree was easily cut in half by him. Even the wolf-tooth club used by the gnolls was cut in 2 or 3 times. The blade of the two-handed axe was only slightly curved. It only needed to be polished again. Hanses, who had obtained a new weapon, excitedly waved the long-handled battle axe. The heavy battle axe in his hand was like a butterfly flying through flowers. The whistling sound of the battle axe breaking through the air could be heard all around. The two-handed battle axe of Florence that he had previously regarded as a treasure was directly thrown into the mud by him. "Boss, this axe is awesome." Hanses waved the axe excitedly and rushed in front of Su Len. The sharp blade of the axe swept past Sullen's side. In an instant, the wooden stick in his hand that was used to measure the depth of the water was cut in half. "It's fun, isn't it?" Looking at the excited Hanses, Su Len directly kicked him and made him roll on the ground. "Pick up the axe and chop down the trees for me. Today, everyone must chop down 30 trees. If you don't finish, there will be no food." A group of barbarians who were watching the fun picked up their axes and ran away. After driving the barbarians away, Su Len picked up another armor. This armor was not a full-body armor, but a half-body armor. The lower part was a leg guard. Although this armor did not have as good protection as a full-body armor, it was more flexible and half the cost of a full-body armor. Although the full-body armor had high defense, it was not flexible after wearing it. Turning around would be greatly limited. It was not very practical except for the heavy cavalry. After testing the strength of the half-body armor, Su Luen was quite satisfied with this kind of armor. It had a good defensive effect against swords and knives, and also had a high defensive power against arrows, but a little weak against heavy weapons. Using this armor to deal with the natives in the wilderness who did not even have a full set of weapons was a complete waste. The blacksmith shop was on the right track, and the construction of the territory was also slowly progressing. Although there were already more than 1,000 slaves, the construction of the territory was still progressing slowly. Of course, this was in Sullen's opinion. In fact, for others, the construction of the territory was already very fast. The main reason was that Sullen's territory was too large. Other nobles' territories were at most the size of a small town, but Sullen's territory was already a large town, or even a small town. At least large towns did not have a 2-kilometer-long, 5-meter-high stone wall. Kobolds, gnomes, and even gnolls were not the best slaves for building a territory. These slaves could only do heavy physical labor. With their pitiful intelligence, they were completely incapable of building a proper house. Most of them built shacks or dug underground caverns. There were a lot of trees in the wilderness. If they used logs to build houses, they would be able to build faster. However, wooden houses were prone to catching fire. Once a fire broke out, they would probably burn down a lot. Furthermore, wooden houses consumed too much wood. In Sullen's opinion, the territory's wood was also a commodity for sale. There were a lot of trees in the wilderness, and there were a lot of them. They were also very sturdy. Whether it was used to make furniture or ships, it was a good choice. This was especially true in the north. Due to the cold weather, trees grew slower, and their texture was more compact and sturdy. It was very suitable for building ships. He planned to sell the wood as the territory's first commodity. Because it was in the north, The weather was very cold in the winter. The houses in the territory were made of mud mixed with reed poles. Although the mud walls looked ugly and gray and looked like they could be pushed down with a push, they were very warm. The walls were more than a foot thick and could completely block the cold from the northern ice plains. Although the walls were a mixture of mud and reed, after the mud was mixed with water and mixed with reed poles, the strength of the mud wall increased a lot. Coupled with the thickness of the mud wall, it was no problem to use it to build houses. At the same time, wooden pillars were added in the mud wall. Although the houses looked ugly, they were the best choice for the territory. Although the kobolds and goblins were not very bright, they were still capable of digging the foundation and transporting the mud. They did a good job of digging the foundation. It didn't take long for the foundation to be dug out. As for the gnomes and gnolls, they were stronger. They were used to beat the mud and mix it. Then, under the guidance of the humans, they built the mud wall on top of the foundation. The construction of the mud wall was simple. 2 wooden boards were erected, and the boards were filled with mixed mud and reed poles. After that, the mud wall was compacted and built. Neither gnolls nor gnolls were comfortable with their new identities. After all, they were much stronger than gnolls and kobolds. They were used to enslaving gnolls and kobolds. They were not used to being enslaved by humans, but they did not dare to resist. In the recent battle, Su Luan's powerful figure and the barbarians' unstoppable power had left a deep impression on them. Although there were only a few barbarians as supervisors, none of the slaves dared to have any thoughts of resistance. They obediently worked under the whips. There was flat land on both sides of the Red Sand River and the White Water River. Many of these lands were covered with lush weeds. The land was very fertile. After the monster army was wiped out, the territory was temporarily free of threats. The reclamation of farmland was put on the agenda. Agriculture would always be the foundation of a territory. With a strong agriculture, the territory would be able to support more people. This way, business and military would be able to develop better. Su Len had checked the land around the river for 2 days. In the area close to his territory, at least 100,000 mu of land could be reclaimed on both sides of the river. Because it was close to the river, there was no need to worry about irrigation. These 100,000 mu of land could be said to be the best farmland in the entire territory. Sullen's farmland was close to the city wall. Other than being close to the city, it had no advantage over these farmland. Of course, now that Su Len had good mechanical technology, if he built some big water wheels and irrigation canals along the river, the farmland here would not be bad. However, the construction of the water wheels and irrigation canals required a lot of money and labor. With the current situation of Sullen's territory, it was not realistic to build irrigation canals that covered the city. The best way was to reclaim the land near the river for farmland. Chapter 27. Kobolds and goblins also knew how to grow food, but their method of sowing was the most primitive slash-and-burn method. They would find a piece of barren land and set a fire to burn all the weeds on the ground. When it rained, they would scatter some seeds on the ground. As for the harvest, that was entirely up to fate. Although the goblins and kobolds were bad at farming, they were still capable of reclaiming barren land. Su Len planned to reclaim 5,000 mu of land in his territory before the north wind arrived. At the very least, his territory had to be self-sufficient in terms of food. These barbarians were all gluttons. The amount of food they consumed was 3 times that of ordinary people. In this world, apart from nobles and merchants, ordinary people ate 2 meals a day. These barbarians were the same. However, Su Len planned to eat 3 meals a day. As the main fighting force, they could not fight on an empty stomach. The only problem was the lack of food. There were 45 slave artisans and 35 barbarian warriors in the camp. After a while, the barbarian women and children would also arrive. By then, there would be a total of 124 barbarians, 40 mercenaries, and more than 1,000 native slaves. With so many mouths to feed, the amount of food they consumed had quadrupled. What used to be a few months' worth of food was now only enough for 2 months at most. If he wanted to develop his territory, he needed enough manpower. Although there were more than 1,000 people in his territory, the goblins, gnolls, and kobolds were definitely not allowed to join his territory. Su Len understood this principle very well. That was why he did not have many people in his territory. Races like the barbarians and dwarves weren't that different from humans. At the very least, they didn't have the custom of cannibalism. Gnolls, kobolds, and goblins didn't have any taboos. They wouldn't even let the corpses of their allies and clansmen go, let alone humans. The gnolls did not only use the goblins as cannon fodder. In fact, they also used them as food. When there was not enough food, the gnolls and kobolds would be eaten directly. Therefore, these monsters could only be treated as slaves. They could not be allowed to join the territory as free people. North of the Red Sand River, Sulen led a group of barbarian warriors to clear out the goblins and kobolds. Because the surrounding tribes had all been wiped out by Sulen, there were still groups of 3 to 5 wandering goblins and kobolds in the wilderness. These weed-like monsters would probably form a new tribe in a few months. In order to maintain the rule of this land, Sulen would come every once in a while to clean up some and capture some as slaves. The construction of the territory was very heavy. Even in the 21st century of his previous life, there were many safety guarantees, but there were still all kinds of accidents. In this world where the productivity was not even comparable to the Middle Ages, it was normal for a few slaves to die. Therefore, in order to ensure the progress of the project, it was necessary to capture some slaves every once in a while. Boss, we've discovered a small goblin tribe in the forest ahead. There are about 200 to 300 goblins, including some earth goblins. A barbarian who had returned from scouting reported. Sulen nodded and opened the strategic map in the system. At this time, the strategic map had already marked the location of the group of goblins. He had already discovered that as long as he or his army passed by, the originally black area on the map would disappear and the situation of the land would be revealed. Just like now, in the forest 5 kilometers northeast of them, it was marked that a group of goblins lived here. The strategic map was not only useful within the territory. After confirming the location of the goblin tribe, Sulen prepared to bring the barbarians to kill all the goblins. The dozen barbarians split into 2 teams and went around the camp from both sides. Sulen led 2 barbarians to attack from the front. The goblins had low combat strength and weak willpower. The death of their companions would have a great impact on them. In fact, even a single barbarian warrior could defeat them. After 10 minutes, Sulen had arrived outside the goblin tribe. There was no need for a sneak attack to deal with these goblins. A wave of attacks would be enough to end the battle. The next step would be to capture the slaves. There were no guards outside the goblin tribe. The entire goblin camp looked run down. There were many small houses piled up with mud. These houses were actually called crypts. Most of them were underground and had no windows. There was only one entrance, and the surroundings were supported by wood. Although they looked run down, these houses were good at keeping warm. Many poor people in the north absorbed the advantages of these crypts and built half of their houses underground. Sulen looked at the strategic map. The other 2 teams of barbarians had already arrived at their predetermined positions. He waved his hand and led 2 barbarians to the camp. The 3 of them were quickly discovered by the goblins. One of the goblins picked up his weapon and yelled at the other goblins to pick up their weapons and get into formation. However, before he could complete the formation, a hand axe spun and smashed into his head. Kill! Suluin brandished his steel spear and smashed the fence outside the camp to pieces with a force of 10,000 pounds. The goblins who had just come to their senses crawled out of the crypt in a panic. When they saw the tall barbarian, they did not even have time to react before they were sliced in half by the axe. For a moment, the 3 of them were like 3 meat grinders, rampaging through the territory. The remaining goblins were scared out of their wits. Before the fight even started, they had already scattered and turned to flee. Only a few goblins picked up their broken weapons and formed a simple military formation to resist. Seeing this situation, Sulen adjusted his direction and charged forward. He swept his steel spear across and sent a few goblins flying like a sandstorm. Although there were no obvious wounds on the surface of these goblins, the leather armor on their backs had exploded. Broken organs mixed with blood spurted out of their mouths. They were dead before they hit the ground. With the death of a few goblins, no other goblins dared to resist. All the goblins scrambled to escape. However, they ran into the barbarian warriors who were waiting for them as soon as they ran out of the camp. Faced with an even greater number of barbarian warriors, these goblins who were already out of their wits only felt that the entire world was filled with malice towards them. The battle ended quickly. The 3 sides surrounded the goblins. Apart from a few dozen dead goblins and a few lucky ones who managed to escape, the rest of the goblins were all sprawled on the ground, their bodies trembling as they huddled together. Do it according to the old rules. Kill the old and weak. Tie up the rest and take them back as slaves. Chapter 28. These barbarians were already familiar with this. They arranged for people to collect the spoils of war while tying the goblins up. As expected, this goblin tribe did not have much wealth. There were only a few metal weapons. Other than the goblin slaves, there was basically no additional income. After a simple rest, the team was split into two. One group of barbarians escorted the 200 goblin slaves back to the camp, while Sulen led a few other barbarians to continue patrolling the area. The army passed through the forest and advanced toward the northeast. A rolling mountain appeared in the distant horizon. The huge mountain range was like a giant beast that stretched across the land. That was the Kandahar Mountains. The Whitewater River that flowed through the territory originated from this mountain range. The wilderness in autumn was a little dilapidated. The plants had begun to turn yellow. The animals that needed to hibernate had begun to store fat for themselves to survive the winter. This was also the season when animals were at their fattest. Sulen found a place with a wide view and ordered the army to rest and prepare for dinner. A barbarian warrior hunted an antelope nearby. These barbarian warriors used to be hunters in the wilderness. Hunting an antelope was a piece of cake. Soon, after a simple preparation, a warrior began to roast the antelope. Boss, about 5 kilometers to the east, we found a herd of wild cows. Just as Sulen was about to cut the meat, a barbarian who was sent out to investigate ran back and reported. Herd of wild cows? How many are there? Hearing that there was a herd of wild cows, Sulen did not care about roasting the meat. He threw the meat to a barbarian warrior beside him and reached out to grab the barbarian who had reported the situation. Very big, a very big herd. The barbarian was not very sensitive to numbers. He drew a big circle in front of him with his hands. Are there as many of them as the goblin tribe we just wiped out? Sulen asked as he took the meat from the soldier behind him and passed it to the warrior. After taking the meat, the warrior took a few big bites and said, "Not as many as the goblins, about half of them. They should be preparing to migrate." Less than half. Sulen's eyes lit up, but he kept calculating in his heart. A small half meant about 100 bison. 100 bison was not a small number. No matter if he caught them to eat meat or use them for farming, these bison could not be let go. Right now, the territory was planning to cultivate 5,000 mu of land. Although they had put in a lot of effort, the progress was still slow. If they had oxen, the 5,000 mu of land could be cultivated in a few days. Moreover, in the coming year, they could cultivate more land. Everyone, hurry up and eat. We'll gather in 10 minutes. Thinking of this, Sulen immediately said. He was ready to catch all the bison immediately. After all, these bison had legs. If he was late, who knew where they would run to? Soon, all the barbarian warriors had finished their preparations, and Sulen rushed towards the direction of the herd under the lead of the soldier. There were both cattle plowing and horse plowing in this world. Horse plowing was faster while cattle plowing was slower. Both had their advantages and disadvantages. The group quickly moved towards the northeast line of defense. After about 15 minutes, Sulen and his men arrived at the location that the scout had mentioned. It was a high slope with a wide field of vision. The surrounding environment was unobstructed. Below the slope was a plain, and the herd of bison was leisurely grazing on the plains. There were a lot of bison. Sulen counted at least 130. Such a large herd of bison was rare in the wilderness. Although bison were ordinary beasts, they were more ferocious. These animals could weigh up to a ton and were at least 3 meters long. They also had a pair of curved and sharp horns on their heads. At first glance, one could tell that they were very lethal. These bison were also herd animals, which made them even more dangerous. More than 100 bison that weighed more than a ton charged together like thunder. The consequences of their charge were no less than the charge of the Empire's heavy cavalry. There are so many bison. We can't let any of them go, Sulen said excitedly. With these bison, the reclamation of the territory could be sped up. The barbarians were very experienced in taming bison. After all, when they lived in the wilderness, their tribes had reared many bison. Now that they were here to catch bison, this was their old profession. Because he was worried that the herd would scatter, Sulen prepared to catch the leader of the herd. He spread out his men and let the barbarians form a circle around the herd. Then, Sulen personally went to catch the leader of the herd. In fact, it wasn't difficult to distinguish the leader of the herd. The strongest one was the leader. Su Len stood on the high hill and scanned the area, trying to find the leader. After a few rounds of observation, Su Len finally confirmed the leader of the herd. As he approached the herd, the bison that were grazing were very alert to Sulen's arrival. A few of them were even ready to charge at Su Len and knock him away at any time. They mooed a few times at Su Len, then pointed their horns at Su Len and kicked their front hooves back and forth a few times. Su Len didn't care about these bison's provocation. He walked toward the herd without any hesitation. Seeing that Su Len ignored their warning, a few of the bad-tempered male bison charged at Su Len. In the end, Su Len punched them in the head and knocked them out. Since he wanted to catch these bison for farming, he naturally couldn't use too much strength. What if he killed them? After knocking out these bison, Su Len didn't stop at all. He quickly rushed toward the leader of the herd. The leader of the herd didn't show any signs of weakness. He also rushed toward Su Len. As the leader, this bison was even bigger. It was more than 3 meters long and had a lot of followers behind it. Unfortunately, it met Su Len. Before it could show its strength, it was knocked down by Su Len. Shaking its head, the leader stood up shakily. As soon as it stood up, Su Len jumped on its back. After realizing that there was someone on its back, the leader tried to throw Su Len off. However, no matter how hard it tried, Su Len sat firmly on its back. In the end, the leader of the herd was exhausted and couldn't throw Su Len off. It could only bow its head and admit defeat to Su Len. After successfully taming the leader of the herd, the remaining 100 or so bison were no longer a problem. The leader mooed a few times at the herd, and the originally restless herd calmed down. Then, Su Len rode the leader of the herd and led them toward the territory. The other barbarians followed on his left and right. The 100 or so bison running gave off an unstoppable momentum. Chapter 29. After capturing more than 100 bulls, Su Len did not continue to venture deeper into the wilderness. He planned to bring them back to camp first. Even if only half of these bulls could be turned into cattle, it would still be a huge improvement for Sulen's agriculture. As for the advantages of cattle plowing compared to horses, Su Len was so poor that he couldn't even afford horses, let alone horse plowing. Moreover, horses were much harder to raise than cattle, even though they were fast and plowed a lot. Whether it was military horses or ordinary horses, the requirements for raising them were very high. Horses were very delicate animals and were easily damaged. A good military horse in colt would cost at least 30 kinner. The better ones would cost 40 or even 50 kinner. Moreover, these military horses needed to be fed with fine feed and extra meals at night. It could be said that the feed for these horses was better than what most people ate. A military horse like this would consume at least 10 kinners worth of food every year. Although ordinary horses did not need to be fed so well, they would still need at least 3 kinners worth of food every year. It should be noted that many commoners only earned about 5 kinners worth of food a year. In comparison, the cost of raising cattle was much lower. Moreover, when a horse died, it would only be left with a piece of horse skin. When the cow was old, its meat could be sold for money. Not to mention, the horns could be used to make bows. Naturally, cattle plowing was more cost-effective. The bulls Su Len brought back were very irritable and difficult to tame. It was not easy for ordinary people to tame them. Most of the time, they would even hurt themselves. However, this was not a problem for the barbarians. The barbarian tribes in the northern wilderness would usually catch wild bulls to raise. Taming wild bulls was a basic skill for them. Moreover, Su Len had an ultimate method of taming wild bulls: piercing their nostrils. The nose of a bull was very sensitive. After piercing their nostrils, even the most irritable of wild bulls would become obedient babies. As for the fact that adult bulls were too strong to pierce their nostrils, 2 barbarian warriors would be able to easily pin them to the ground. When they returned to the camp, Su Len counted the bison. There were 97 adult bison, 42 of them were bulls, and the rest were cows. There were 21 one-year-old calves. Su Len intended to let the barbarian women and children feed and cultivate these buffaloes. In the present camp, these women and children were the most suitable. As time passed, Su Len had been in the wilderness for a month. After the hard work of more than 1,000 goblins, kobolds and gnolls, the camp changed every day. The pier of the Red Sand River had expanded a lot. From the beginning, there were only 3 fishing boats. Now, there were 7 fishing boats. The berths at the port had also expanded by 5 times. It could accommodate more ships loading and unloading goods at the same time. Downstream of the river, a row of 4 water wheels stood by the river. These water wheels were the hydraulic machinery of the blacksmith shop. 2 of them were hydraulic forgers, one was a hydraulic blower, and the other was a crusher used to crush ores or scrap iron. However, there were no iron mines in the territory, so this machine was not in operation. The walls of the camp were all made of stone. The 5-meter-high and 1-meter-thick walls surrounded the entire camp. Although these walls were far inferior to those in Carenta City, or even Blackstone City, they were enough to defend against the goblins, kobolds, and gnolls. With these walls, the safety factor of the territory was increased by 50%. In addition to the walls, many roads in the territory were opened. From the establishment of the camp to the sawmill, the port, and the farmlands, many of these roads were paved with stones. Large amounts of polished cobblestones were scattered on the riverbank. Sulen had the goblins and kobolds transport them up in bamboo baskets to pave the roads. To build these roads, they first flattened the soil, then sprinkled water on it. After the cobblestones were pressed in, they were rolled back and forth with stone rollers. In the end, the roads were smooth and firm. Even on rainy days, they would not become muddy, and on sunny days, they would not become dusty. In terms of roads alone, Sulen was already better than many of the major human cities of this era. On both sides of the roads were drainage canals that were about 1 meter wide and half a meter deep. According to Sulen's plan, the entire camp must have a complete drainage system that could discharge all the sewage in the city. He could not tolerate his territory being shrouded in the smell of fermented feces and urine like the other cities of this era. Outside the walls, not far from the river, more than 500 goblins and kobolds were using tools to cultivate the farmlands under the supervision of a few human mercenaries. A team of supervisors was urging them to work hard. If any slave dared to slack off, a whip would quickly come down and tear his flesh apart. These supervisors were not humans. They were also goblins and kobolds. After a period of enslavement, some of the smarter goblins and kobolds took the initiative to pledge allegiance to the humans. Sulen thought about it and agreed. After all, the territory was severely understaffed, and these goblin supervisors could make up for it. As for the goblin supervisors going easy on the workers, such a situation would never happen. With the selfish, arrogant, and cowardly personalities of the goblins, they bullied their own kind even more than the humans after becoming supervisors. If they did not do well, Sulen would not punish them. He would just throw them back, and the oppressed goblin slaves would treat them well. Sulen also discovered a problem. The slave supervisors were actually recognized by the system. Goblin supervisor. Increase goblin work efficiency by 20%. Decrease slave safety by 10%. It was originally a goblin, but in order to eat better food every day, it decided to pledge allegiance to Sulen. It has a decent talent for languages and has learned a part of the human language. It can communicate with humans. At the same time, it is familiar with the goblins' habits and can better command the goblins. Apart from the goblins, there were also kobolds and even gnolls who were willing to pledge allegiance to him as supervisors. This greatly reduced the lack of manpower in the camp. Sulen was used to the clean and tidy layout of the cities in his previous life. He had the same requirements for his territory. In his city plan, the roads were neat and tidy, and there were drains on both sides of the roads. There were even flower beds on both sides of the roads. In the gaps between the roads were neatly divided plots of land. These plots of land were either houses or shops, giving off a clean and tidy feeling. On every street, there were public toilets set up at the same location. If the city was built according to Sulen's design, it would definitely be the cleanest city in the world. Chapter 30. Sulen's lord's castle was under construction. According to the design, his lord's castle was very spectacular and majestic. But considering the current situation, he could only build part of it first and leave the rest for the time being. He would continue the construction when he had enough time and money. It wasn't that he didn't want to capture more slaves to work for him, but the main problem was food. Without enough food, it was impossible to feed more people. The first 500 mu of farmland had been planted with potatoes. These potatoes would mature before winter, and now Sulen was preparing to expand the planting of potatoes. The first batch of land was very fertile. Even without fertilizer, the yield would not be low. Apart from keeping some of these lands, Sulen planned to distribute the rest through military rewards, sales, or distribution to slaves with meritorious service. As long as the land was planted with crops, the territory would receive agricultural taxes. The sale of the land would also receive a sum of money. This way, his territory would have a stable source of income. Of course, this was the best-case scenario. His territory was now in the middle of nowhere, and no free people were willing to come. Therefore, this method ended before it even started. If he wanted to increase the population of his territory by attracting free people, it would be better to buy slaves. Su Luan's territory was like an upside-down bowl. The camp was at the highest point of the bowl, surrounded by 2 rivers and surrounded by plains. Su Luan had also measured the land that could be reclaimed when he patrolled the territory during this period. After marking it on the strategic map, he calculated that the land that could be cultivated was more than 200 square kilometers. If all of this land was cultivated, at least 300,000 mu of farmland would be cultivated. With so much farmland, it would be more than enough to feed 30,000 to 50,000 people. Of course, even if the territory was developed, it still needed to clear out the monsters in the wilderness. 2 days later, Johnson returned with dozens of barbarian women and children. With these women and children joining the territory, the manpower in the territory was finally not so tight. These women and children were very curious about the territory, but they quickly threw themselves into the construction. According to Sullen's reward standards, these barbarian soldiers could obtain land and get rid of their status as slaves to become citizens of the territory. After knowing that they could rid themselves of their status as slaves and become free citizens, these barbarians burst with passion and threw themselves into building up their territories. What surprised Su Len was that other than the barbarians, there was also a caravan that came back with Johnson. This caravan had 44 wheeled carriages and more than 150 people. Honorable Lord, I'm Owen, the manager of the Bauhinia Chamber of Commerce. I'm very pleased to meet you here. A slightly plump man with a shrewd look flashed through his eyes from time to time. My caravan will need to pass through your territory. We will pay the tax according to the normal standards. Owen, is your caravan going to the depths of the wilderness? Su Len was very interested in Owen. Any caravan that dared to venture into the wilderness was no weakling. With the danger level of the wilderness, caravans that were not strong enough had a high chance of dying. If this caravan dared to do business in the wilderness, they must be strong. At the same time, this also showed that they would definitely make a lot of money on this trip. If there were not enough profits, why would these caravans take such a huge risk to come here? Mr. Lu Sun said it well. If there was a 10% profit, the capital would be used everywhere. If there was a 20% profit, the capital would be active. If there was a 50% profit, the capital would take risks. If there was a 100% profit, the capital would dare to trample all the laws of the world. If there was a 300% profit or more, the capital would dare to commit any crime and even risk being beheaded. Su Len was about to go crazy from poverty. How could he let go of any opportunity to make a fortune? Owen was also very surprised. He was surprised that the noble in front of him had set up a settlement here. As a caravan that often traveled in the wilderness, they knew very well how difficult it was to set up a camp here. The Jackalan tribes in the wilderness were not easy to deal with. Thousands of Jackalans, goblins, hound-head men, and trolls. With such a lineup, even 1,000 well-trained elite human soldiers might not be able to win. Most of the time, both sides would suffer. Moreover, this territory had already built a 5-meter-tall wall. How much manpower and resources did it take to build such a wall? One had to know that this place was more than 200 kilometers away from the nearest city, Blackstone City. To maintain 1,000 human soldiers and build such a wall, the cost would make most nobles go bankrupt. This young human noble dared to build a city here. What was even more surprising was that he found a large number of goblins, hound-head men, and Jackalan slaves in this territory. This meant that they had a firm foothold here. Yes, Lord. Our caravan is preparing to enter the depths of the wilderness to trade with some other races. Jackalans? No, Jackalans prefer to rob directly. We are trading with the Ellen tribe in the north. They are a group of centaurs. Centaurs? Su Len said in surprise. Yes. Su Len wanted to continue asking, but Owen had no intention of talking about the details of the trade. But even if Owen did not say it, Su Len had a rough idea of what they were trading. It was nothing more than bows and arrows, horses, and some wilderness specialties such as furs and magic materials. Centaurs were good at raising horses, and their tribe was also famous for their longbows. The caravan traded food and other daily necessities. A round trip would yield at least 10 times the profit. Okay, I agree to let your caravan rest here, but according to the rules, you have to pay 10% tax. Sulen quickly agreed. Of course you can pay with kinner or food. Thank you for your kindness, Lord. We will prepare the tax soon. Hearing Sulen's words, Owen nodded. 10% tax was normal. In fact, Owen had considered not paying the taxes, but after seeing the size of the territory, he dismissed the idea. There was no need to be surprised. Few merchants in the wilderness were good people. They would often act as bandits and even plunder some territories. Although Sulen's territory looked simple, the power it represented was not something ordinary people could achieve. Without a strong military force, they could not defeat the monster army. Not to mention capturing so many wilderness natives as slaves. Chapter 31. Centaurs were a powerful race in this world. They were born to be cavalry and were good at raising horses and archery. Centaur longbows were very famous in the human world. They were second only to elven longbows and were comparable to half-elven bows. The strongest Thunder Knights in the Kingdom of Florence bought their horses from the Centaur tribe. The horses produced by the Centaur tribe were fat, tall, and strong. They were the best horses and were very suitable for heavy cavalry mounts. Of course, there were many better mounts, such as magic beasts. Magic beasts that were beyond the category of wild beasts, such as unicorns and nightmare beasts. If they formed a knight order, they would be stronger than all the knights on the continent. However, there was a key problem. Whether it was unicorns, nightmare beasts, or other magic beasts, there were too few of them. Unicorns were the elves' friends and lived in the legendary elven forest. Nightmare beasts were even rarer. There were also a few. Therefore, only a few noble knights would look for magic beasts as mounts. The knights that needed a lot of mounts could only use ordinary horses. Humans also domesticated a lot of horses, but the quality was not as good as the horses raised by the centaurs. Even if there were one or two good horses, it could not change the fact that the whole race was not as good as the horses raised by the centaurs. Sulen knew that Owen's caravan was going to trade with the centaur tribe, so he had some plans in his mind. Now that his territory only had barbarian warriors, he also needed cavalry and longbow archers. But now his territory was poor. If he wanted to trade with the centaur tribe, he had to at least have something they needed. How could he trade with them if he had nothing? Sulen was also a little confused, but he also had an advantage. Now his territory was the only territory on the trade route from the Kingdom of Florence to the Centaur tribe. As long as they passed through his territory, it was normal to pay a toll. It was normal to collect some centaur longbows and horses. Owen's caravan was transporting a lot of goods this time. There were a lot of ironware and the rest were food. Although the centaur tribe was very strong, the quality of their ironware was average. Iron ore was rare in the wilderness, so the price of ironware was very high. As for food, the centaur tribe was a semi-nomadic tribe. Their farming ability was very poor and their food production was low. In comparison, Sulen suddenly realized that his territory was still very advantageous. Owen was also curious about Sulen. As the steward of the Bauhinia Chamber of Commerce, he had been walking on this trade route for more than 10 years. During this period, there had been nobles who had come to this area to develop their territories. However, until Sulen's arrival, no nobles had succeeded in establishing themselves here. Owen had never thought that in just a month, a pioneering noble would come here and successfully establish a foothold here. This made him feel incredibly shocked. What surprised him even more was the strength of this lord. Previously, he had crossed the wilderness with the barbarian women and children. Along the way, they had encountered many wilderness bandits. The barbarian leader had led 2 equally powerful barbarians to crush a group of bandits. That kind of irresistible and invincible attitude left a deep impression on him. None of the mercenaries under him were his opponent, and only a few of them could take a few of his axes. This kind of strength had already surpassed the knight rank. Even the remaining 2 barbarian warriors had reached the knight rank. Toward such powerful warriors, his first thought was to recruit them. In order to recruit them, Owen had promised to give them land and kinner to settle down the barbarian women and children. However, to his disappointment, the barbarians had directly rejected him. Even if he kept raising the conditions, the barbarians did not waver at all. Just as he was thinking of increasing the price, The caravan had arrived at Sullen's territory. When he arrived, he realized that the barbarians were actually this pioneering noble's people. Moreover, this young noble had relied on the barbarian warriors to establish a foothold in the wilderness. Owen sat cross-legged on the carpet in the tent. Not only was the carpet from the desert kingdom exquisite, but it was also soft and comfortable to step on. A short table was placed on the carpet, and the leaders of the caravan guards were respectfully sitting not far away. Each of them had a cup of ale in front of them. The temperature in the wastelands was very low at night, and alcohol was the most popular beverage in the north. On a cold night, drinking a cup of ale would heat up one's stomach, and one's body, which had been frozen stiff, would quickly warm up. Alec, other than the 3 barbarian warriors who came with us, how are the other barbarians' strength? Owen put down his cup and asked. Very strong. The mercenary with a long scar on his face said in a low voice. Those barbarians have an aura. I've only seen this kind of aura from knight-rank powerhouses. After he finished speaking, he lowered his head and took a sip of ale. The spicy ale was a little bitter. He did not like this kind of cheap ale, but he subconsciously wanted to hide the shock in his heart. Although he did not want to admit it, with his many years of experience as a mercenary, it was not difficult to see that each of the barbarian warriors in this territory could be called a strong warrior. All of them? That's impossible. More than 30 strong men who are at least at the knight level. How can they be willing to stay in this broken territory where they have no money and no men, and where they have to face the attacks of gnolls and other monsters all the time as ordinary soldiers? Owen could not accept this situation at all. More than 30 knights were already comparable to some weak counts in the kingdom of Florence. Although these barbarians were not knights, their fighting strength was not inferior to knights. If they were willing to be loyal to the nobles, even if they could not become knights, their treatment would definitely be better than here. In this world, strength and status were directly proportional. Those high-grade warriors were all supported, but the warriors in this territory were like ordinary soldiers. This was completely unreasonable. Owen's mind was filled with thoughts, and the bamboo cup in his hand unconsciously turned in his hand. Could it be a different situation? Just when everyone else was silent, a thin mercenary with a cold expression said while playing with a dagger in his hand. These barbarians have no idea what kind of treatment they can get in the kingdom with their strength. After the others looked at him, the mercenary slowly said, "Clap." Owen clapped his hands and excitedly stood up as he said, "That's right, how could those barbarians and country bumpkins know the value of 100 gold coins? That's the only explanation why they're here." Chapter 32. I know, they must have been tricked by that lord. As long as I tell them my true value, those barbarians will definitely leave him. Then our chance will come. Owen paced around the tent excitedly. From his expression, it seemed like he had already recruited more than 30 powerful barbarian warriors. I'm so stupid. No wonder Johnson didn't care about my conditions. They don't even know the difference between silk and linen. I should have known. Ahem, sir. We are now in the territory of that noble lord. Doing this seems. The leader of the mercenaries, Alec, reminded him. Yes, this is still his territory. Owen finally came to his senses and stopped. However, he couldn't hide the excitement on his face. His eyes flickered continuously, and no one knew what he was plotting in his heart. The next morning, Owen handed a carriage full of goods to Wang Yi as tax. Su Len accepted it without hesitation. He was so poor that he didn't need to be so courteous. After paying the tax, Owen requested that their caravan rest in the city for 2 days before leaving. Su Len agreed to his request. Su Len ordered the slaves to move the goods from the carriage to the warehouse. When they were in the warehouse, Su Len checked that the carriages were filled with food. This was good news for Su Len. Due to the sudden increase in population, he didn't have enough food. A carriage like this could carry 1,000 pounds of goods. 1,000 pounds of food might not be much in Cult City, but here, the value of 1,000 pounds of food was at least 10 times higher. There weren't many types of trade in the wasteland. Tea, cloth, salt and so on. The most popular trade was ironware. Grain wasn't the most profitable. Owen brought so much food because the Centaur tribe requested that there must be a certain percentage of grain and ironware in the trade. Originally, the Centaur tribe didn't lack food. However, they had been at war with an orc tribe for the past few years. Naturally, they didn't have enough food. If it weren't for the caravans transporting large amounts of food, the Centaur tribe wouldn't have been able to survive. Now that they were able to hold on, it was their opponents' turn to suffer. The long war had caused them to lack food. They had been evenly matched at the beginning, but now they were barely holding on. On the second day after the barbarian women and children arrived, Sulen began to distribute houses and land to the barbarians. There were already 50 to 60 houses in the camp. Although the houses made of mud and reeds didn't look good, it was still comfortable to live in. It was much better than the houses the barbarians used to live in. Each of the 35 barbarian warriors was given a house. Apart from them, the women and children of Sulen were also given a house. Although they didn't have any battle achievements or points, they could still owe them. In addition to the houses, each family was given 20 mu of farmland and 30 mu of wasteland to cultivate. As for the wild bulls, they also needed to be exchanged for battle merits or points. Of course, if he didn't have enough battle merits or points, he could still owe them. Soon, more than 30 of the 100 or so bison were distributed. Sulen also rewarded the mercenaries with land, but it was much less than the barbarians. Most of them were about 5 mu. After all, the mercenaries had limited battle merits, and the points they earned every day were also very little. After receiving the land, the group of mercenaries was also very happy. Although the days of the mercenaries seemed to be very carefree, and some bards said that the mercenaries' adventurous life was magnificent, but in reality, most of the mercenaries didn't have a good life. Many of the mercenaries didn't have land, money, or proper jobs. In the end, they could only be mercenaries. Of course, many of them became bandits. If there was land to farm, many mercenaries wouldn't be in this line of work. In the Kingdom of Florence, the land had already been distributed. Except for some farmers, the rest of the land was basically divided up by the nobles. With the growth of the population, the farmers who didn't have land could only leave their hometown and come to the city to work. They didn't have any skills, so most of them became coolies or mercenaries. Now that they had land, these people naturally didn't want to live a life of bloodshed. It was foreseeable that these mercenaries would become the first batch of free people in Sulen's territory. Just as Sulen was busy distributing land to the mercenaries, Owen also began to secretly contact the barbarians. Most of the barbarians were forthright and carefree. After facing a businessman like Owen, they quickly had a good impression of him. After gaining the initial trust, Owen began to tell these barbarians what kind of treatment powerful warriors like them should receive. He also promised that as long as they were willing to follow him back to the Kingdom of Florence, all of these could be realized. However, to his disappointment, the barbarian mercenaries were not interested in the knighthood or the treatment of nobles that Owen had mentioned. Hence, they directly rejected his recruitment. Owen couldn't accept this at all. Of course, he didn't give up. Instead, he went to contact other barbarians. The result was exactly the same as before. All the barbarians rejected Owen's recruitment. This was unexpected. Damn it, what's going on? Why are those barbarians still unwilling to cooperate with me after I explain things so clearly? Owen said angrily in the tent of the caravan's encampment. The other mercenaries around him looked at each other a few times, but no one answered. Sir, is it because these barbarians don't trust us? One of the people who looked like a merchant said. After all, we just met them. It's normal for those barbarians to be vigilant. Maybe we should take out something to show them our sincerity? That's also a way. Then I'll leave this matter to you. Owen thought for a while and still wasn't willing to give up, so he decided. If Sulen knew what Owen and the others were thinking, he would definitely laugh himself to death. All the barbarians had a loyalty value on the system interface. Now, most of these loyalty values were above 90, and there were even some that were above 100. With such a high loyalty value, it wasn't something that could make them betray. Moreover, the barbarians worshipped the strong. After following Sulen for a while, many of them had become loyal to Sulen. It was basically impossible for them to betray him. Chapter 33. You're saying that Owen is in contact with your subordinates? He wants you to work for him? Sulen was holding an iron skewer and roasting a sturgeon over the bonfire. The delicious sturgeon was smeared with Sulen's special seasoning and emitted an enticing aroma as it roasted over the fire. Johnson swallowed his saliva and forced himself to look away from the fragrant sturgeon that was roasted to a crisp on the outside. Yes, when we were with his caravan earlier, he asked us to work for him, but I refused. Well done. Sulen blew on the grilled fish and took a bite of the juiciest part of the fish. The special seasoning mixed with a sweet and smooth fish flesh brought the taste buds the best enjoyment. Gulp. The sound of someone swallowing came from the side. Here's the seasoning. Go roast it yourself. Don't be an eyesore here. Su Len took out a small bottle of seasoning from his pocket and casually tossed it to Johnson. Thanks, boss. Johnson caught the small bottle in a panic and carefully sniffed it. He then grinned at Su Len and left excitedly. Su Len finished the grilled fish in his hand in a few bites and rubbed his belly with satisfaction. He picked up the ale beside him and drank a few mouthfuls before letting out a comfortable burp. After dinner, Su Len asked Johnson to gather the barbarian warriors for a short meeting. After that, he wandered back to sleep and completely ignored Owen's little actions. Owen had been worried that Su Len would come looking for him, so he had specially prepared a set of excuses. However, he was surprised that Su Len didn't respond. This made Owen a little uncertain, but he still didn't give up on recruiting the barbarians. After learning about the rewards that Su Len had given to the barbarians, he increased the rewards by several times and continued to lobby. He didn't mention any other titles or fiefs at all. Unexpectedly, he actually succeeded this time. The barbarians that had ignored him yesterday actually agreed to his recruitment. However, although they agreed to the recruitment, he still needed Sullen's approval to take these barbarian warriors away. However, Owen didn't think that it was a problem. As the manager of the Bohemia Chamber of Commerce, he wasn't an ordinary merchant. One had to know that he was involved in the arms trade. Since ancient times, how could ordinary merchants be involved in the arms trade? The owner of the Bohemia Chamber of Commerce was Marquis Chrisman. At the same time, he had countless connections with the royal family. Otherwise, where did the Centaur tribe's Thunder Knights get the war horses from? With the royal family and Marquis Chrisman backing him up, he didn't believe that Su Len, a nobleman who was pioneering, would dare to not give him face. Therefore, after confirming that the barbarian warriors had agreed to his recruitment, Owen immediately came to discuss with Su Len. What did you say? You want me to let those barbarian warriors go? Su Len slammed the table with an angry expression. It seemed that he was ready to attack in the next second. Sir Su Len, I know that this will be a great loss to you, so I'm willing to compensate you for your loss. Owen's expression was calm and relaxed. He displayed aristocratic etiquette incisively and vividly, as if he was a true noble. Owen clapped his hands lightly. A servant behind him walked forward and placed the black wooden box in his hands on the table between the two of them. Then, he respectfully retreated. Sir Su Len, as long as you agree to let those barbarian warriors who are willing to leave, here are 500 kinner. This is the Bohemia Chamber of Commerce's support for your development of your territory. With that, Owen gently opened the wooden box, revealing a box full of kinner. Su Len didn't say anything. He reached out and grabbed a handful of kinner. The heavy texture, the cold temperature, and the sparkling golden light. The cute kinner was so tempting. Looks like you've made your decision, Owen said with a smile, like a spring breeze. He sneered in his heart. Another short-sighted noble. It looked like this territory wouldn't last long. Perhaps when his caravan came from Owen's special city again, this place would be in ruins again. When was the last time something like this happened? 2 years ago, or 3 years ago? There seemed to be no trace of what happened to that territory. Now that he thought about it, the grass on that noble's grave was 3 feet tall. I refuse. The kinner slipped from his hand and fell into the box again. There was a melodious sound of metal hitting metal. What? Owen looked at the young noble in front of him in surprise. He obviously didn't expect Su Len to refuse him. Ding dong! Ding dong! The sound of kinnar hitting metal rang in his ears. Su Len said in a serious tone, "Those barbarians are my private guards. They have accompanied me through many bloody and corpse-strewn battlefields. They have borne countless hot-blooded glories. They are my most trusted comrades, my closest companions, and my sworn brothers. Do you understand? You have to add more money. Add another 1,000 kinnar and 2 carts of food." Owen took a few deep breaths and forced himself to calm down. Then, a trace of disdain flashed in his eyes. Deal. Su Len slammed the table and said very straightforwardly, "But I want the 1,500 kinnar in cash. The things must be delivered to me today, or the deal is invalid." Okay. Owen agreed immediately. He didn't bargain with Su Len anymore. He didn't want to stay here for another minute. Not long after that, Owen sent his men to deliver the promised kinnar and supplies. He didn't even bother with the noble etiquette. He left his territory with the caravan and 17 barbarian warriors. Su Len was in a very good mood after receiving another 1,500 kinnar and 2,000 pounds of food. He didn't care about Owen's attitude at all and personally sent the caravan out of his territory. Su Len didn't plan to keep the 1,500 kinnar in his hands. Money couldn't be put to good use in his hands. Although his territory was developing well, the population was too small. He planned to buy some ordinary slaves and let them farm for him. The price of these serfs wasn't high. A serf could be bought for 2 kinnar. This time, he planned to buy 500 serfs at once. As for the remaining 500 kinnar, he would use it to buy food. Of course, he wouldn't leave his territory now. Without him in the territory, who knew if the gnolls would rebel or if the monsters in the wilderness would take the opportunity to attack? Therefore, he could only let his men go. The candidate was the former mercenary leader, Xian. Su Len had just discovered that this cowardly mercenary leader was also a talent. After officially joining his territory, Su Len found that Xian's attribute panel had a trade skill.